"You're alone," Marcus Sterling said, and he smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that belongs on a man who has never once been wrong about anything. "No family, no future. This land is already mine. You just haven't accepted it yet." Henry Lawson stood on his porch and said nothing. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just looked out past Sterling's shoulder toward the long empty road that ran through the Montana flats, and he waited. Then the old burner phone in his coat pocket rang. He answered it without looking down. A voice said quietly, "We're 5 minutes out." And then the ground began to shake. If this is your first time here, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Follow this all the way to the end, because what happens in the final hour of this story will stay with you for a long time. And drop a comment right now telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The foreclosure notice had been taped to Hank's front door on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday he had read it 11 times. Not because he didn't understand it the first time. He understood it perfectly. He read it 11 times because each time he finished it, some stubborn and unreasonable part of him expected the words to be different. They never were. 90 days, that was what they gave him. 90 days to come up with $214,000 in back payments, penalties, and what the bank called administrative restructuring fees, a phrase so cold and bureaucratic that Hank had to sit down the first time he read it just to let the absurdity of it settle into his bones. Administrative restructuring fees, as if the bank were doing him a favor by dismantling his life with proper paperwork. He was 67 years old. He had lived on that land for 41 of those years. He had buried his father in the east field next to the old hickory that had been split by lightning in 1987 and somehow kept growing anyway. He had built the south barn with his own hands the summer he turned 32, working from 5 in the morning until dark every day for 6 weeks, and when it was done, Eleanor had brought him a cold beer and sat beside him on the new wood floor and said, "Hank, I think this might be the best thing you've ever made." He'd kissed her and told her she hadn't looked in a mirror lately. She'd laughed. He could still hear it. Eleanor had been gone for 3 years now. Pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end. He hadn't had enough time to say everything he needed to say, and now he would carry that incomplete sentence for the rest of his life. After she died, the farm started dying too. Not all at once, just slowly the way old things go, a piece at a time, quietly without announcement. The cattle operation that had once run 200 head was down to 40. The Southfield lease he'd depended on for 10 years got bought out from under him when the neighboring property sold. The equipment loan he'd taken out the year before Eleanor got sick came due in the worst possible season, when beef prices collapsed and the hay crop came in thin. He had refinanced twice. He had sold the truck. He had eaten canned soup for 3 months straight and told no one. And still it wasn't enough. The bank First Continental Agricultural, the name that sounded like it belonged on a Civil War monument, had been patient right up until the moment they decided to stop being patient. Then they moved fast. Papers filed notices, sent timeline established. The man they sent to manage the situation was named Marcus Sterling, and from the very first conversation Hank had with him over the phone, he understood exactly what kind of man Marcus Sterling was. Sterling was 44 years old, wore pressed shirts even in rural Montana, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never wanted for anything. He was not cruel in the way that comes from meanness. He was cruel in the way that comes from indifference, from looking at a man's entire life and seeing only a line item on a spreadsheet that needed to be resolved. He had done this before, many times. He would do it again. To him, Henry Lawson was not a person. He was a problem with a solution, and the solution was already scheduled. Sterling had come out to the property twice before the morning of the final notice. The first time he brought an appraiser, a thin man named Gerard, who walked the property with a clipboard and wrote things down without making eye contact. The second time, Sterling came alone and offered Hank what he called a voluntary surrender arrangement, meaning Hank would sign the deed over willingly in exchange for a modest cash settlement and a written waiver of any future legal claims. Hank had read the documents for 20 minutes at the kitchen table while Sterling sat across from him checking his phone. Then Hank had set the papers back down and said, "No." Sterling had looked up from his phone as if he'd forgotten Hank was there. "I'd encourage you to reconsider," he said. "The alternative is considerably less comfortable." Hank had said, "I imagine it is." and Sterling had left. That was 6 weeks ago. The morning Sterling arrived with the sheriff and the bulldozer, Hank was already on the porch. He'd been up since 4 the way he always was, old habit, from decades of livestock that didn't care what the clock said. He'd made coffee, eaten 2 eggs with toast, washed his plate, and then put on his coat and his boots and come outside to sit in the wooden chair that had been his father's. And he had watched the road. He knew they were coming. He just didn't know exactly when. He heard the convoy before he saw it. 3 vehicles. Sterling's leased SUV, black and clean, in a way that looked deliberately out of place on a dirt road. Sheriff Dale Pruitt's cruiser behind it, the light bar off which Hank took to mean Pruitt was hoping this would go quietly. And behind the cruiser, a flatbed truck hauling a Cat D6 bulldozer, its yellow paint bright, even in the gray winter morning. Hank watched them come and he felt something move through him that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. It was something older than either of those things. Something that lived in the part of a man that only wakes up when everything he has built is about to be taken. Sterling got out of the SUV and straightened his coat and walked toward the porch with the easy confidence of a man who had already won. He had 2 men with him, assistants, Hank supposed, or lawyers. It was hard to tell the difference. They hung back by the vehicle and let Sterling come forward alone. Sheriff Pruitt got out of his cruiser more slowly. He was a big man, mid-50s, with a face that had done hard things and remembered them. He put his hat on and walked to a position roughly equidistant between Sterling and Hank, like a referee who hadn't decided yet which side he was on. The bulldozer operator stayed in his cab. The engine was off. Sterling stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at Hank. "Mr. Lawson," he said. His voice was even and professional and completely empty of anything human. "Today is the final day of your notice period. I have the executed court order here authorizing the bank to take possession of the property." He held up a folder. "I also have paperwork for an orderly transfer. If you'll cooperate, this can be handled with minimal disruption." He paused. "If you won't cooperate, then the sheriff will assist us in removing you from the premises, and the remediation equipment will begin clearing the structures." He said remediation equipment, the same way the notice had said administrative restructuring fees. A clean word for a dirty thing. Hank looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Pruitt. "Dale," he said, "you plan on being part of this?" Pruitt met his eyes and something uncomfortable moved through the sheriff's expression. He was a man caught between the law he was paid to enforce and a conscience that had opinions about it. "Hank," he said, and then stopped because there wasn't anything honest he could say that would make this better. "I don't have a choice here. The order is legal." Hank nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I'm not blaming you." And he meant it. Pruitt looked away. Sterling stepped up onto the bottom stair. "Mr. Lawson, I want to be clear about something." His voice dropped slightly, going from professional to something more personal and more dangerous. "I have done this 47 times in the last 6 years, 47 properties. And not once has a man in your position found a way to change the outcome. The papers are filed, the order is signed, the machine on that truck will start when I tell it to." He looked at Hank with the flat certainty of someone who has never been surprised. "You're alone, no family, no future. This land is already mine. The only question left is whether you walk off it with your dignity or whether we carry you." Hank was quiet for a very long moment. Long enough that Sterling almost said something else. And then Hank said in a voice that was entirely calm, "I know I'm alone." He reached up and touched the brim of his old wool cap. "I've been alone for 3 years. I know what it feels like." Sterling opened his mouth. "But I've been sitting on this porch since 4 o'clock this morning," Hank continued, "and I haven't been waiting for a lawyer or a judge or a miracle. I've just been waiting." He looked past Sterling again the same way he'd looked past him the first time out toward the long empty road. "And I think my wait is just about over." Sterling turned to follow his gaze. The road was empty. He turned back. "Mr. Lawson." And then Hank's coat pocket buzzed. He reached in and pulled out a phone, not a smartphone, one of those old flip phones, the kind you bought at a gas station for $30, the kind you used when you didn't want a record of your calls. He opened it and pressed it to his ear. He didn't say hello. He just listened for about 3 seconds. And then the voice on the other end said clearly enough that Sterling could almost catch the words, "We're 5 minutes out." Hank closed the phone and put it back in his pocket. Sterling stared at him. Who was that? Hank looked at him with something that wasn't quite a smile. You'll see, he said. And then the ground started to shake. It was subtle at first. The kind of vibration you feel in your feet before you hear anything, the way big trucks on a highway can make a roadside diner rattle slightly even when they're still a mile out. Sterling noticed it and looked down at his expensive shoes. Confused, one of his assistants said something and pointed. Pruitt turned toward the road, his hand going instinctively to his belt. The bulldozer operator opened his cab door and looked out. The sound came a few seconds after the vibration. Low at first like distant thunder, but wrong for thunder. Rhythmic, too mechanical, too purposeful. It rose steadily, filling the cold air from all directions, and then it resolved itself into something recognizable: engines. Not one engine or 5 or 20. Many engines. The kind of collective mechanical roar that rewrites the acoustics of everything around it, that makes the air itself feel different. Sterling was still staring at the road when the first riders crested the long flat rise about a mile out. And then the second wave. And the third. The road, which had been empty since dawn, was suddenly not empty at all. What is, Sterling said, and then stopped because he didn't have a category for what he was looking at. Hank watched them come. He didn't move. He didn't smile. He just watched, and something in his chest that had been clenched very tight for a very long time began very slowly to release. He had not called them. That was the thing people would struggle to understand later when this story got told and retold around kitchen tables and in honky-tonk bars, all the way from Billings to Bozeman. He had not called them. He had not asked for anything. He had given them his phone number 6 weeks ago when the last of them was well enough to leave, given it to their president, a man named Silas, who went by Grim, pressed on a scrap of paper with 2 fingers still bandaged from frostbite. And he had said only one thing. If you ever need a friend in Montana, you've got one. He had not given them his number so they would come. He had given it because it was the right thing to do, and Hank Lawson had spent 67 years making a habit of doing the right thing, even when nobody was watching. But someone had been watching, or rather someone had been paying attention. One of the club members had set up a Google alert on Hank's name just to keep tabs on the old man. A week ago, the alert had fired, pulling up a local court filing notice buried in the Glacier County Public Records database. A property foreclosure, a name Henry Lawson, an address they all recognized because they had woken up there half-frozen and alive 6 weeks prior. Silas had read the alert on a Tuesday evening. By Wednesday morning, every chapter in the Northern District knew. By Thursday, the word had gone regional. By Sunday, it was national. And by the following Saturday, which was today, which was this morning, which was right now, 650 Hells Angels riders had converged from 9 states riding through cold. They normally would have avoided pushing through weather and distance and logistics that would have stopped most organized convoys. Because the one thing the world consistently misunderstands about men like this is that when they decide someone is worth showing up for, they show up completely. The first bikes reached the property line and slowed, fanning out in a long double line that spread across the width of the road and then beyond it into the field margin, engines dropping to a rolling idle. More came behind them, and more, and more. Sterling stood at the base of the porch steps and watched what had been an empty Montana road turn into something that looked from a distance like a river of steel. This is, he said, this is trespassing. This is, he turned to Pruitt. Sheriff, you need to. Pruitt was watching the road with an expression that Hank recognized. It was the expression of a man doing rapid math on a situation and realizing that the numbers didn't work out the way he'd expected. There were 2 deputies in the county on duty this morning, 2 deputies and 1 sheriff and a bulldozer operator and 2 lawyers standing on a piece of property that was being surrounded slowly and without apparent aggression by 650 people on motorcycles. Marcus, Pruitt said quietly, I think you need to lower your voice. Sterling stared at him. You're the law enforcement here. I'm aware of that, Pruitt said. His voice was very careful. I'm also aware of what this looks like, and I'm asking you to lower your voice. One rider separated from the front of the formation and came forward alone, cutting the engine and rolling to a stop at the edge of Hank's property. He got off the bike slowly with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has never once felt the need to rush, because he has never once been in a situation he wasn't confident he could handle. He was somewhere around 50, built lean and hard with gray threaded through his dark hair, and a beard that had been worn long for so many years, It looked like a natural feature of his face. His vest was black leather, and the patch on the back was the one that had been on every vest in every Blizzard story Hank would carry for the rest of his life. He walked to the fence line and stopped. He looked at the porch. He looked at Hank. And then after a moment, he put one hand on the fence post and lifted his chin slightly, not in greeting, not in threat, just in acknowledgement. One human being to another. I see you. I'm here. Hank raised one hand off the arm of his chair. Just briefly. It was enough. Sterling was still talking. He was talking to Pruitt and then to his assistants and then to his phone, which he had pulled out and was holding up as if signal strength were his primary problem. His voice had lost the professional evenness it had carried all morning. He was a man watching his script dissolve, trying to find a new one fast enough to stay ahead of the situation. This is illegal assembly, he was saying. This is intimidation. I want this documented. I want every plate number. Marcus. Pruitt said his name with a flatness that made Sterling go quiet. Look around. Sterling looked. He turned slowly, doing the full rotation, taking in the half-mile of motorcycles now idling in a wide arc around the property, riders sitting or standing, none of them moving toward anything, none of them saying anything. Just there. Present. Unmistakably, overwhelmingly, irreversibly present. The documentation can wait, Pruitt said quietly. Right now, I think you and I need to have a conversation about how this morning is going to go. Hank watched this exchange from his chair and felt something he had not felt in 3 years come back into his body like warmth returning to a frostbitten hand, a slow, almost painful return of something that had been absent so long, he'd stopped noticing the absence. He felt for the first time since Eleanor died like he was not alone. Not just not alone in the technical sense of other people being physically present, but not alone in the deeper sense. The sense of having people who would stand in cold weather on a Saturday morning because you had mattered to them, and mattering to people is the only thing that makes a life. He had not expected this. He genuinely, truly had not expected this. He had made peace in the 6 weeks since the bikers left with the idea that the farm was going to go. He had grieved it the same way he grieved Eleanor quietly at night in the kitchen with no audience. He had started making a list of what he would take with him when he left. His father's watch, Eleanor's recipe box, the photographs. He had made the list because making lists is what you do when the feeling gets too large to simply sit with. And now 650 men were on his land, and the bulldozer operator had gotten all the way back into his cab and appeared to be on the phone, and Marcus Sterling was sweating in the cold Montana morning, and Dale Pruitt was looking at Hank with something new in his eyes. One of Sterling's assistants, the younger one, maybe 26, with the look of a recent law school graduate who was seriously reconsidering his career choices, walked quickly to Sterling's osteri and said something in his ear. Sterling's face changed. He pulled away from the assistant and looked at his phone and then looked at it again, as if the screen had just said something in a language he didn't recognize. What do you mean the injunction was, he said loudly enough for Hank to hear. The assistant said something else quieter. Sterling's jaw worked. He looked up from his phone and looked at Hank. And for the first time since this had all started, there was something in Sterling's face that wasn't certainty. There was something that looked very much like the beginning of fear. Hank looked back at him without expression. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the burner phone there smooth and warm from being carried. He thought about the voice on the other end, 5 minutes out. He thought about what it had cost him to drag 19 men into a barn in a blizzard, the effort, the cold, the exhaustion that had dropped him to his knees twice in the snow. He thought about how he hadn't done it because he expected anything back. He'd done it because they were dying, and dying men don't have affiliations or reputations. Dying men are just men. He thought about Eleanor, who would have laughed until she cried if she could see this 650 Hells Angels on their Montana dirt road, and then she would have said, knowing her, "Well, Hank, I told you those old bones of yours were still good for something." He could hear her voice. He held it for a moment, then let it go. The man from the fence, Silas, though, Hank didn't know his name yet, would learn it only in the next hour, began walking toward the porch. Sterling saw him coming and stepped partially in front of the porch steps, reflexive, the way men do when they feel their position being encircled. "This is private property," he said. "You have no right." Silas didn't acknowledge him. He walked at the same unhurried pace and simply went around Sterling the way water goes around a stone, without drama, without confrontation, without even appearing to register the obstacle. He came to the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Hank. Up close, the frostbite scarring on his left cheek was visible, old-heeled, but permanent. A record on his face of what this old man had pulled him back from. "Mr. Lawson," he said. His voice was quiet and very direct and had the particular quality of a man who never wastes words because he understood at some point in his life that words are currency and you spend them carefully. "My name is Silas. People call me Grim." He paused. "You don't remember me. I was the one who woke up in the corner of your barn in the blue sleeping bag 3 weeks ago, the one you had to pour hot soup into because my hands weren't working right." Hank looked at him. He did remember. Not the man's face, they had all blurred together in the exhaustion of those days. But he remembered the blue bag. He remembered the soup. He remembered the hands. "I remember," Hank said. Silas nodded. "Then you know why we're here," he said. "Not because you asked us, because some debts don't wait to be called." Sterling said from behind them, "This is not a legal proceeding. Whatever you think you're—" "Marcus," Pruitt's voice again low and flat and carrying the finality of a man who has made a decision. Sterling stopped. Pruitt walked to him and positioned himself close enough that what he said next was meant only for Sterling. But the air was quiet and cold and sounds carried, and Hank heard it. "I'm going to need you to stop talking," Pruitt said, "because what I'm seeing right now is 600 people who have not broken a single law surrounding a property where you are attempting to execute a court order that may have significant procedural problems, and I am not going to be the person who turns this into something else because you can't manage your mouth." Sterling's face went very still. "What procedural problems?" Pruitt looked at him. "Your assistant just got a call. I saw his face when he got it. You know what procedural problems." Something moved through Sterling's expression, a flash of something he controlled quickly. Something that looked very much like a man suddenly unsure of the ground under his feet. He said nothing. On the porch, Hank Lawson looked out at his land, the fields that had fed his family for 40 years, the south barn he had built with his own hands, the east field where his father lay under the split hickory that kept growing anyway. He looked at all of it and he felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a thing worth carrying, a thing worth fighting for, a thing that was perhaps not finished yet. Silas was still at the bottom of the steps. Hank looked down at him. "How far did you come?" he asked. Not because it mattered legally, because it mattered to him personally as a man to understand the scale of what had been given. Silas considered the question for a moment. "Some of the boys rode from Texas," he said. 2 chapters came in from Washington State. We had people from as far as Ohio." He paused. "Total 9 states." Hank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "In January." Silas looked at him with something close to a smile. "In January," he confirmed. The 2 men looked at each other across the porch step, and in that look passed the entire language of what had happened between them. The blizzard, the barn, the soup, the survival, and now this. Sterling had moved away from Pruitt and was on his phone again, pacing the edge of the yard. His voice was clipped and fast, and Hank couldn't hear the words anymore. Only the cadence, which was the cadence of a man trying very hard to get ahead of something and finding that it had already lapped him. The bulldozer sat on its flatbed engine cold, going nowhere. Hank reached into his coat pocket again, but this time it wasn't for the phone. It was for Eleanor's photograph. He always carried it, a small one, worn at the edges from the summer of 1992, her in the garden with dirt on her hands and the sun hitting her hair exactly right. He held it for a moment without looking at it, his thumb on the edge. "What do you think, El?" he said so quietly that only the photograph could hear. The cold wind moved through the yard. Somewhere behind the ridge, 650 engines idled. The sound was like the earth breathing. The morning, which had begun as an ending, was becoming something else entirely. And Marcus Sterling, standing in Hank Lawson's yard with a court order in one hand and a phone in the other, was beginning to understand slowly with the particular horror of a man whose certainty has been surgical and total and has just been removed without anesthetic, that he had badly, profoundly, and perhaps irreversibly miscalculated whose land he was standing on. On the porch, Hank put the photograph back in his pocket. He settled deeper into his father's chair. And he waited the way he had been waiting since 4 a.m. with the patience of a man who has nothing to prove and everything to protect. The engines breathed behind him. The cold held, and the farm, his father's farm, Eleanor's farm, his farm stood. The engines outside were still running. Hank could feel them in the porch boards beneath his boots, a low, continuous vibration that was almost like a heartbeat. 650 heartbeats synchronized into something that sounded from where he sat like the land itself had finally decided to push back. Sterling was still on his phone. He had walked to the far edge of the yard and turned his back, and the conversation he was having was clearly not going the way he needed it to go because his free hand kept moving, sharp, chopping gestures, the body language of a man who is used to giving orders and is discovering that today, for reasons he cannot fully process yet, the orders aren't landing. Pruitt had taken his hat off and was holding it in both hands, which Hank recognized as the sheriff's tell. He had known Dale Pruitt for 22 years, and the hat always came off when Pruitt was trying to think without the weight of his office on his head. He was looking at the road at the long line of bikes and riders, and his face had the expression of a man doing serious moral accounting. Silas was still at the bottom of the porch steps. He hadn't moved, hadn't pushed, hadn't made any demand or issued any statement. He was simply present, and his presence had a quality to it that Hank had only encountered in a few people in his life, the kind of stillness that isn't emptiness, but is in fact a very controlled fullness. A man who has seen enough of the world's worst that he no longer needs to perform. "You're their president," Hank said, "not a question." "National president," Easter said, "going on 11 years. Hank looked at him steadily. "You rode from where?" "Denver." A pause. "Left Thursday night." Hank did the math. Denver to northwestern Montana in January on a motorcycle. He thought about what that ride would feel like in his own body, the cold, the highway miles, the weight of it. And he thought about what would make a man in Silas's position decide that ride was worth taking. "You didn't have to do this," Hank said. Silas looked at him with a directness that was almost uncomfortable in its honesty. 19 of my people were dying on your driveway," he said. "You went out in a blizzard that would have killed most men half your age, and you dragged them inside one at a time. You almost killed yourself doing it." He stopped. "So no, I didn't have to do this. I wanted to." The distinction in his mouth carried a weight that Hank understood completely. It was that word "wanted" that took Hank back. Took him all the way back to the night that had started all of this, the night that felt in retrospect like the moment his life had pivoted on a hinge he didn't know was there. It had been 3 weeks ago, the third week of January, which in northern Montana means weather that doesn't apologize. The forecast had called for a winter storm. They always called for a winter storm. That time of year, it was barely news. But what came down out of Canada that night was something different. Not a storm, a system. The kind of sustained total whiteout that erases the difference between the road and the field and the sky and makes every familiar thing unrecognizable. Hank had gone to bed at 9:30 the way he always did, with the wind already picking up and the temperature dropping faster than the forecast had predicted. He had checked the barn, the 40 head were in, the water lines were wrapped, the feed was stocked. He had come back inside and locked the door and gone to bed. He was asleep within 10 minutes. He had been sleeping alone for 3 years, and he was still not entirely used to the silence of it, but exhaustion is a great leveler, and by 9:40 he was out. He woke at 11:52. He knew the time because he looked at the clock on the nightstand before he did anything else, an old habit from years of farm emergencies that had trained his first conscious act to always be time orientation. 11:52. The wind was doing something to the house that wasn't normal. Wind noise. It was finding gaps, working at the roof line, pressing against the north wall with a sustained pressure that made the whole structure sound like it was holding its breath. But that wasn't what had woken him. What had woken him was something lower, something that didn't belong to the storm. He lay still for a moment, cataloging wind, the creak of the house, the distant sound of the cattle shifting in the barn, and underneath all of that, or maybe through it, something else. He couldn't name it at first. It was too diffuse, too intermixed with the storm's own noise. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat there in the dark for another moment, listening. Then he heard it clearly for half a second between wind gusts, a sound that was almost human, but wrong in its rhythm, wrong in its texture. Not a voice, or not just a voice. Multiple voices, or the suggestion of them, and underneath that, something mechanical that had stopped being mechanical and was now just cold metal in a field. He put on his boots without untying them. His coat was on the hook by the back door. He was outside in 40 seconds. The cold hit him like a door slamming. Not just cold, the kind of cold that has malice in it that wants to get inside you and stay there. The wind was blowing hard from the north and carrying ice crystals that stung every inch of exposed skin. He clicked on his flashlight, and it immediately showed him nothing but white. The snow in the air was thick enough to cut his visibility to maybe 15 feet. He heard it again. Closer now? Or maybe the wind had shifted. From the direction of the driveway, he went toward it. He found the first one about 30 feet from the end of the driveway, face down in the snow. A big man, leather vest, jeans, boots that were completely wrong for this weather. No helmet, his hands were under his body, and he wasn't moving in a way that indicated consciousness. Hank dropped to his knees and grabbed the man's shoulder and rolled him over. The face that came up was gray-white. The lips had gone blue, and the eyelids were at half-mast over eyes that weren't tracking. Alive, breathing barely with shallow chest movement, but not by much. "Hey," Hank said. He slapped the man's face lightly. "Hey, open your eyes." The man's eyes moved behind the lids. "Stay with me," Hank said. "I've got you. Stay with me." He got his hands under the man's arms and pulled. The man was 220 pounds if he was an ounce, and Hank was 67 years old with a lower back that had been arguing with him for a decade, and the snow was 8 inches deep, and the wind was blowing 40 miles an hour, and none of that mattered even slightly. He pulled. It took him 4 minutes to get the first man to the barn. He came back for the second. The second one he found leaning against a motorcycle that had slid off the driveway edge and gone over on its side. The man was conscious, barely eyes open, shaking so hard his teeth had given up chattering and gone silent, which Hank knew was worse. "Can you walk?" Hank shouted over the wind. The man's mouth worked. I think." He couldn't stand up on his own. Hank got under his arm and walked him to the barn. 3 was 50 feet further out, unconscious, in a ditch. 4 and 5 were together near the road, one of them trying to help the other stand and not managing it. By the time Hank had found all 19 men scattered across the length of his driveway, in the road shoulder, in the field margin, he had made 11 trips in and out of the blizzard. His gloves were soaked through. His right knee had given out on the 7th trip, and he had fallen in the snow and lain there for probably 30 seconds, his face in the cold, his whole body screaming, and he had thought very clearly, "You can stay here, and nobody would blame you. You are 67 years old, and your knee is not right, and it is 40 below with wind chill, and there are more men out there." And then he had gotten up, because the alternative was that men died on his land while he rested, and Henry Lawson had not been raised to be the kind of man who rested while people died. The barn, by the time all 19 were inside, looked like a triage ward. Men laid out on the hay on feed bags on every piece of cloth Hank could find, saddle blankets, moving pads, the canvas tarp from the east wall. He had his 2 space heaters running on extension cords from the house positioned low near the men who seemed worst off. He had the barn door shut against the wind. He stood in the middle of it and looked at what he'd brought in and tried to figure out what to do next. He knew enough about hypothermia to know that rewarming was everything and that you did it carefully. Wet clothes off dry insulation on no direct heat that could cause shock-warm liquids if they were conscious and could swallow. He went to the house and he put 3 big pots on the stove. Water for broth water, for tea water, to fill every thermos he owned. He dug out every blanket in the house. He found Eleanor's old emergency kit in the hall closet she had always insisted on keeping. One had packed and repacked it twice a year the way some people tend to garden, and he took the thermal emergency blankets out of it, all 6 of them, and he thought about her hands packing them there. And he said, "Thank you, Elle," out loud to the empty kitchen, and then he picked up the kit and carried it to the barn. He worked through the night. When he ran out of broth, he made more. When blankets were soaked through from wet clothing, he took them to the dryer and ran them and brought back the ones that were done. He checked on every man every 20 minutes, walking the length of the barn with his flashlight, looking at lips and skin color and breathing. He moved 2 of them, the ones he was most worried about, closer to the heaters and propped their upper bodies slightly so their airways were better. He had called 911 at the beginning when he first understood the scale of what he was dealing with, but the dispatcher had told him the roads were completely closed, a pileup on the highway had blocked the county's plows, and the storm was still intensifying, and that no ambulances could get through until morning. He had thanked her, hung up, and decided that morning was a long time away, and he was what these men had right now. Around 2 in the morning, one of the men who'd been unconscious when Hank found him came back. He was maybe 35 thick through the shoulders, with tattoos climbing both sides of his neck, and when his eyes opened all the way, and he looked around at the barn, and then up at Hank, who was crouching beside him with a thermos of broth, the expression on his face was one of total uncomprehending disorientation. The look of a man who is not sure if he is alive. "You're okay," Hank said. "You're in my barn. You're safe." The man stared at him. "What?" His voice came out like gravel through a bent pipe, hoarse from the cold. "How?" "Storm hit you hard," Hank said. "I found you in the ditch. Can you drink this?" He held the thermos forward. The man looked at it, then looked at Hank, and something shifted in his face. A slow, dawning recalibration like a compass, finding north. He reached for the thermos with both hands, and his hands were shaking so badly that Hank had to help him hold it. He drank. He closed his eyes and drank, and when he opened them again, he said, "How many of us?" 19, Hank said. "All inside, most of them sleeping." "Sleeping or sleeping," Hank said firmly. "All of them breathing. 2 I was worried about, but they've steadied out." The man was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he looked directly at Hank with an intensity that was uncomfortable in its focus. "You carried us in," he said. "All of us." Hank shifted on his knees. "It wasn't all of us," the man said again louder, and this time it wasn't a question. Hank looked at him. "Yes." Another pause. A long one. "You shouldn't have been able to do that," the man said. "You're no offense, sir, you're not young." "No," Hank agreed, "I'm not. And it's 40 below out there." "About that. And you don't know who we are." Hank looked at him steadily. "I know who you are. You're 19 men who were dying in my driveway." He shrugged, a small movement, the shrug of a man who has genuinely not considered any other option. "That's enough for me." The man stared at him for so long that Hank started to wonder if the cognitive effects of hypothermia were still working on him. Then he said, "My name is Danny. Daniel Reeves. I'm the road captain for the Montana chapter." He extended a hand, shaking but deliberate. Hank took it. "Hank Lawson," he said. "This is my farm." They shook hands in the barn at 2 in the morning, surrounded by 18 sleeping, hypothermic men, with a blizzard running full outside. And in that handshake was the beginning of something neither of them had a word for yet. Danny tried to get up around 3 o'clock, and Hank pushed him back down with a hand on the chest. "Not yet," Hank said. "Your core temp isn't right yet. Another hour at least." Danny looked like he wanted to argue, and then looked at Hank's face and didn't. "Who does that?" he said instead. "Who carries 19 strangers into a barn in the middle of the night?" It was the 3rd or 4th time something like this had come out of him, the inability to compute what Hank had done within any framework of experience Danny had. Hank thought about how to answer honestly. "My dad always said the measure of a man isn't what he does when people are watching," he said. "It's what he does when he's the only one there." He paused. "I was the only one there." Danny looked at the roof of the barn. "Your dad sounds like he was a smart man." "He was," Hank said. "He's buried in the East Field." Danny looked at him. "This farm has been in your family 41 years, Hank said. By morning, the storm had broken. By 7 o'clock, men were waking up in sequence, the barn filling gradually with the sounds of consciousness returning. Movement voices, the occasional sharp inhale of a man taking stock of pain he hadn't known he'd sustained. The 2 men Hank had been most worried about, a rider named Colt, who'd had the worst core temperature, and another man named Perez, who'd been in the ditch the longest, were sitting up and coherent. Everyone was alive. All 19. None of them could fully account for why. When Silas came fully awake, the corner of the barn, the blue sleeping bag, the hands that couldn't grip Hank, was there with soup. He didn't know this was the national president. He didn't know this was the most senior man in the room. He brought soup because Silas was awake and looked like he needed it, and that was the extent of the calculation. Silas took the mug in both bandaged hands and looked at Hank over the rim. He didn't say anything right away. He was a man who had long since learned that first impressions in extraordinary situations needed time before words were put on them. He looked at the barn, at his people laid out around him, at the heaters and the blankets and the thermoses and all the evidence of what one old man had done through an entire night in the worst winter storm in 5 years. Then he looked back at Hank. "You didn't sleep," he said. "No," Hank said. "And you didn't call the police." "I called 911 for the ambulances," Hank said. "Roads were closed." But you didn't call anyone else about us. Hank met his eyes. You weren't a threat to me, you were in trouble. Silas was quiet again. Then, a lot of people see our patches and make a different call. I imagine they do, Hank said. He shrugged. I'm not most people. Silas looked at him for a long time. Then he said very quietly, no, you're not. And in those 3 words, there was an entire assessment, thorough and final, of the kind of man Silas spent his life evaluating. He had spent 30 years around every variety of human being the world produces, and he had developed a sense for authenticity that was nearly clinical in its accuracy. What he saw in Henry Lawson was something he didn't encounter often. A man who had done an enormous thing and was genuinely puzzled by the suggestion that it was enormous. A man for whom the right action and the only available action were always the same action. The riders spent the day recovering. Hank cooked everything in his freezer, everything in his pantry, whatever he had that could feed 19 large men in varying states of physical recovery. He made 2 pots of chili, 4 dozen eggs, enough toast to fill a bread box 3 times. He didn't ask anyone for anything, and he didn't make a production of the feeding. He just cooked and brought it out, and men ate, and some of them said thank you, and some of them couldn't find the words yet, and that was fine. In the afternoon, when the roads had been plowed enough for vehicles to move, 3 of the men went out to assess the bikes. 6 were totaled. 3 more needed serious work. The rest were rideable but had sustained damage from the cold and the crash when the formation had hit the ice. Danny came back inside after the assessment and sat at Hank's kitchen table with the expression of a man doing sums he didn't like. We need a few days, he said, to get some of this sorted. Hank looked at him. Then stay, he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Danny blinked. Mr. Lawson. Hank. Hank, we're not... He stopped searching for how to say it. We're not the kind of people most people want around for a few days. Danny. Hank said, you've been here 12 hours and you haven't broken a single thing in my barn. That puts you ahead of my cousin Gerald, who I will never forgive for what he did to the south fence in 2009. Danny stared at him. Then he laughed. It came out like it surprised him, genuine, unguarded, the laugh of a man who had not expected to laugh today. He shook his head. Okay, he said, a few days. They stayed 4. In those 4 days, something happened in the farmhouse and the barn that Hank didn't have a tidy word for, but that he understood in his bones. Men who had been strangers became not friends exactly, but something real. Something built on the specific foundation of having been helpless in front of each other. The riders who had been unconscious, and the old man who had dragged them through a storm, which is a different kind of knowing than anything social, any chosen community. This was not a friendship formed over shared interests. This was something formed over survival, and it had a different weight. They helped around the farm without being asked. Small things at first. Someone noticed the split rail on the north fence and fixed it before Hank had thought to mention it. Someone went out to the barn without prompting and fed and watered the cattle at 4:30 in the afternoon when it was clear Hank was exhausted. On the 3rd morning, Hank came out to find 3 of them in his equipment shed doing something methodical with tools and discovered they had identified the hydraulic leak on his baler that he had been planning to deal with in spring and had fixed it. He stood in the shed door and looked at this and didn't say anything for a moment. You didn't have to do that, he said finally. The man with the wrench, big guy, maybe 40 arms that looked like they'd been built by actual labor rather than a gym, looked up. We know, he said. We wanted to. There was that word again. When they left on the 4th day, Silas was the last one out. He stood in the driveway with his bike idling and looked back at the farmhouse and then at Hank standing on the porch. He walked back to the porch one more time. He took a small piece of paper out of his vest pocket and a pen and wrote a number on it. Then he walked up the steps and held it out. That's my personal number, he said. Not a club number, my number. Hank took it. If you ever need anything, Silas said. He looked at Hank steadily. Anything, you call that number. Hank folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. I appreciate that, he said. He hesitated. I've got one of those old prepaid phones. Barely use it. Let me give you that number in case you ever need a friend in Montana. Silas had taken the number. He'd put it in his phone. He'd ridden out the driveway and turned on the highway and disappeared into the winter morning. That had been 6 weeks ago. Now Silas was standing at the bottom of Hank's porch steps with frostbite scars on his cheek and 650 men at his back. and Marcus Sterling was pacing the edge of the yard with a court order that was suddenly not as solid as it had been an hour ago, and Sheriff Pruitt had his hat in his hands in the look of a man rewriting his understanding of how this morning was going to end. Danny appeared from somewhere in the formation and came to stand beside Silas. He looked up at Hank on the porch, and his face broke into the same unguarded expression as when he'd laughed in the kitchen. "Hank," he said. He shook his head. "You still won't believe this is a big deal, will you?" "It's a big deal, then," Hank said. "I'm just not the crying type." Danny grinned. Then he turned to look at Sterling, and the grin faded into something more serious. "Who's that?" "His name is Marcus Sterling," Hank said. "He works for the bank that wants my land." Danny's jaw tightened. He looked at Sterling for a moment. Then he looked back at Hank. "Does he know what's coming?" Hank thought about that. "I don't think he does," he said. "He strikes me as a man who prepared very carefully for the wrong situation." Sterling chose that moment to walk back toward the porch. He had apparently arrived at some internal decision. The phone was away. His assistants were behind him, and he had reconstituted the professional composure enough to try again, though it was clearly costing him something to maintain it against the backdrop of 650 engines. "Mr. Lawson," he said. He addressed Hank as if Silas and Danny were not standing 3 feet from him, which was either a deliberate power move or a sign of how badly he'd miscalibrated the room. "Whatever this is," he gestured at the formation, "it doesn't change the legal standing of the court order. The paperwork is the paperwork," Silas said, without turning his head towards Sterling, still looking at Hank, "is being reviewed by 3 separate attorneys in 2 states right now." Sterling stopped. Silas turned slowly, very slowly, and looked at him. "We became interested in your business practices, Mr. Sterling, about 3 weeks ago. 47 foreclosures in 6 years is a pattern. Patterns generate paperwork. Paperwork, as you know better than most, tells a very complete story." Sterling's face went through several changes very quickly. "You have no right." "We didn't do anything you didn't do," Silas said. "We found public records. We read them. We called some people." He paused. "We have a lot of people to call." The engines idled, the cold held, and Marcus Sterling, for the first time in 6 years of doing this to men exactly like Hank Lawson, had nothing to say. Hank watched him and felt something that wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was something quieter than that, more tired, the feeling of a man who has been running uphill for a very long time and has just reached the top and can see what's on the other side. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about his father under the hickory in the East Field. He thought about the long nights with the canned soup and the foreclosure notice he had read 11 times. He thought about 4 in the morning on this porch waiting, not knowing if waiting made any sense at all, doing it anyway, because what else do you do when everything you have is still worth fighting for? The engines breathed. The land held. The morning which had started as an ending was still becoming something else, and it wasn't finished yet. Sterling's mouth closed. It closed the way a man's mouth closes when the words he was about to say have just become useless, not interrupted, not argued down, but simply rendered irrelevant by a larger truth arriving in the room. He stood in Hank's yard with the court order folder still in his hand and looked at Silas, and for a long moment the only sound was the collective audible of 650 engines breathing cold Montana air. Then he found his footing again. Men like Sterling always do, at least for a while. They are built for pressure. They have been in rooms where people push back, and they have always found a way through, around, or over whatever was in their path. It is the specific skill that makes them dangerous, not intelligence, not charm, but the ability to keep moving forward when most people would stop. "Whatever you think you found," Sterling said, and his voice had gone quieter, more controlled. The professional composure locked back down over whatever was happening underneath it. "Public records are public records. They don't constitute evidence of wrongdoing. They constitute a paper trail that my legal team has reviewed thoroughly, and that is entirely clean." He looked at Silas steadily. "I have been doing this for 6 years. I know exactly what I'm doing and exactly how I'm doing it. So whatever your people think they found," "A notary stamp," Silas said. Sterling stopped. "I'm sorry, the notary stamp on the secondary lien document." Silas reached into his vest and came out with a folded piece of paper, not legalized, just a standard sheet folded in thirds. He unfolded it slowly. "Judith Marlin, Notary, Public, Glacier County." She stamped and certified the document on November 14th. He looked up from the paper. Judith Marlin died on October 30th. The yard went very still. Pruitt turned from the road and looked at Sterling. The two assistants looked at each other. Sterling's jaw worked once, twice, and then stopped. His face had gone the particular gray-white of a man who has just felt the floor move under him, who has believed his entire life that the ground was solid and is now receiving the information that he was wrong. He started. That's an administrative error. The stamp is dated November 14th, Silas said. The death certificate is public record, October 30th. He refolded the paper with precise, unhurried hands and put it back in his vest. That's not an administrative error. That's fraud. State-level fraud, which means it touches the federal loan guarantee that First Continental used to fund the acquisition package. He paused just one beat, just long enough for the full dimension of what he'd said to settle into the cold air. Which means it's not just your problem. It's the bank's problem. And the bank, when presented with this information 40 minutes ago by an attorney in Helena, decided very quickly that the appropriate response was to pause all proceedings related to this property pending review. He looked at Sterling without heat, without triumph, with only the flat directness of a man stating facts. Which is what my people were told on the phone 15 minutes ago. Which is what your assistant was told on the phone shortly after. Sterling turned to look at his younger assistant. The young man's face was the answer before he said a word. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Sterling looked back at the folder in his own hand. He looked at it the way a man looks at a weapon he has been holding for a long time and has just realized is unloaded. Then he lowered it. Hank had been watching all of this from his chair on the porch without moving, without speaking. He had his hands rested on his knees and his expression was entirely calm, the calm of a man who has spent the last 6 weeks making peace with one possible outcome and is now discovering that there is another possible outcome and needs a moment to let his understanding catch up. He had not known about the notary stamp. He had not known about Judith Marlin. He had not known that in the weeks since 19 bikers had ridden out of his driveway, people he had never met in states. He had rarely visited, had been pulling documents out of county records, databases, and making calls to attorneys, and building a case that he alone, with no legal resources and no money and no connections, never could have built. He felt something tighten in his throat. He pressed his teeth together and kept his face still because he was not going to come apart on his own porch, not in front of Sterling, not in front of anyone. But the tightening was there, and it was the tightening of a man who has been alone for a very long time, receiving the sudden and overwhelming evidence that he was not in fact as alone as he thought. Danny had moved to stand beside Silas. 3 other riders had come forward from the formation and were standing slightly behind, not threatening, not crowding, just present in the quiet way that large men can be present when they want to make a point without making a scene. Pruitt walked slowly towards Sterling and stopped beside him. He was not confrontational either. His posture was almost gentle. Marcus, he said quietly, using the first name in a way that stripped away the professional distance and made it personal. I think we need to talk about how this wraps up today. Sterling looked at him. Something in his face had cracked, not broken completely, but cracked in the way that expensive things crack when they have been stressed past their tolerance. A fine line through the surface that changes everything, even though the piece is technically still in one shape. There's a dead woman's name on a document you filed with the court, Pruitt said. Still quiet, still almost gentle. Whatever the explanation for that is, it needs to be explained by your legal team to a judge, not by you to me in this yard. And until that explanation has been given and the court has ruled on the validity of the order, he paused and the pause did work. I can't execute it. Sterling stared at him. I can't execute an order that may be based on fraudulent documentation, Pruitt said. I don't have the authority to make that determination in the field, and I'm not going to try. He held Sterling's gaze. That's not me taking sides. That's me doing my job correctly. A long silence. The engines idled. Sterling looked at Pruitt and then at Silas and then at Hank on the porch. And what moved through his face in that sequence was a very complete undoing. Not dramatic, not explosive, but thorough. The kind of undoing that happens when a man realizes that every piece of leverage he walked in with has been removed and that the removal was legal and documented and entirely his own fault. He put the folder under his arm. He straightened his coat with both hands, a reflexive gesture, something to do with his hands while his mind reconfigured. Then he said in a voice stripped of everything that had been in it an hour ago, the professional evenness, the controlled confidence, the practiced cruelty. He said, "I'll be in contact with the court." And he turned and walked to his SUV. His assistants followed. The older one didn't look back. The younger one, the law school kid, glanced over his shoulder once at Hank on the porch, and there was something in his face, not apology, not exactly, but the cousin of apology, the expression of a man who has participated in something he's going to feel differently about later. The SUV doors closed, the engine started, and Marcus Sterling drove down Hank Lawson's driveway and turned onto the road and was gone. Nobody cheered. That was the thing Hank would remember later, the specific absence of celebration in that first moment. 650 people watched Sterling's vehicle leave, and nobody made a sound. The engines breathed. The cold held. And in the silence, something that felt less like victory and more like the simple restoration of what should have always been true settled over the property, like the first warmth after a very long winter. Pruitt stood where he had been standing and looked at his hat still in his hands. He turned it once, twice. Then he looked up at Hank. "I owe you an apology," he said. Hank looked at him. "Dale." "No," Pruitt said. "I should have looked harder at those documents when they came across my desk. I knew this didn't feel right. I knew it from the first conversation I had with Sterling, and I kept telling myself that my job was to execute legal orders, not question them." He shook his head. "That's not good enough. It wasn't good enough for you." Hank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You stopped him when it mattered." Pruitt looked up. "You held the line when it cost you something to hold it." Hank said, "That counts. I'm not a man who keeps score." Pruitt held his gaze. Something moved through the sheriff's face, not relief exactly, but the specific easing of a man who has been given something he was not sure he deserved and has decided after a moment's hesitation to receive it with gratitude. He put his hat back on. "I'm going to start making some calls," he said. "There are some other properties in the county that went through Sterling's process in the last 2 years. I want to look at the documentation." He said it like a statement of intent, a commitment made in public so that it had weight. "I'll let you know what I find." He looked at Silas briefly. Silas gave him a small nod. Pruitt walked back to his cruiser. He got in. He pulled a U-turn in the road, slow and careful, and drove back the way he'd come. The bulldozer operator who had been sitting in his cab since the formation had arrived and who had not gotten out again, and who was from all appearances extremely committed to the policy of not being involved in whatever this was, started his truck and followed. And then it was just the farm, Hank's farm, surrounded by 650 people who had come from 9 states in January to stand in the cold on a Saturday morning for an old man who had never asked for anything. Silas walked up the porch steps. He didn't ask permission. He just came up the way men who have made a decision move, without hesitation, without performance. He stood beside Hank's chair and looked out at his people, at the road, in the fields, in the land that was still standing. "It's not over," he said. "Legally, Sterling will try to regroup. The bank will look for another angle." He glanced at Hank. "We know that." "I know that too," Hank said. "What happens now?" "Now," Silas said, "we get to work." He put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled one short note, not loud but carrying, and from somewhere in the formation a man came forward. He was tall and lean, maybe 45, with reading glasses pushed up on his head and a laptop bag over his shoulder, which was not standard biker equipment, but which in context made complete sense. His name, Hank would learn, was Terrence. He went by Book because he had 2 law degrees and a CPA certification and had spent 15 years as a corporate attorney before a set of life circumstances nobody discussed in polite company had led him to a different kind of life. He was the sharpest legal mind in the Northern District, and he had been building the case against Sterling for 17 days. Book came up the porch steps and shook Hank's hand with both of his. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "I've been looking at your situation for a few weeks now. I want to walk you through what we have and what we need from you." He sat down on the porch railing and opened his laptop. "The notary fraud is the clearest issue. That's the one that immediately voids the current order. But there's more. He turned the laptop so Hank could see the screen. Sterling has been working with a network, 2 law firms, a title company in Billings, and 3 appraisers who have been systematically undervaluing properties to justify accelerated foreclosure timelines. We have documentation on 8 other properties that show the same pattern. He scrolled through something. 6 of those 8 families have already lost their land. 2 are still in process. Hank looked at the screen. He thought about those 6 families. He thought about what it had taken for him to get to this morning. The accident of 19 bikers on his road, the blizzard, the barn, the choice he'd made at midnight in the snow, and he thought about how those 6 families had faced the same machinery he'd faced and had faced it completely alone. "What can we do for them?" he said. Book looked up. He glanced at Silas. Silas gave him a small nod. "That's the question we were hoping you'd ask," Book said. "Because what we can do for them depends significantly on you agreeing to cooperate as a complainant in a broader filing. Your case is the clearest. The dead notary is the thread that unravels all of it." Hank looked at him. "What does that mean for me practically?" "It means depositions," Book said. "Probably months of legal process. It means your name is on a federal filing." He paused. "It means Sterling and his network are going to know you're the origin point, and they're going to be unhappy about that." Hank looked out at the road. 650 engines. Men from 9 states who had ridden in January. He looked at the east field at the hickory tree that had been struck by lightning and kept growing. He looked at all of it. "Okay," he said. Book blinked. "Okay, I wish ye." "I'll do it," Hank said. "Whatever you need." He shrugged. 6 families lost their land. If I can help get it back, that's what I'm going to do. Book looked at him for a moment with an expression that was almost identical to the one Danny had worn in the kitchen 3 weeks ago. The expression of a man who has a large and sophisticated understanding of human behavior and has just encountered something that sits outside all his categories. "All right," he said softly. "All right then." What happened next was not what Hank expected, though. In fairness, he had run out of categories for what to expect about 2 hours ago. What happened was that the formation began to move not to leave, but to reorganize. Bikes rolled off the road and into the field margins, engines cutting one by one, so that the sustained roar became a diminishing chorus engine by engine until there were only a few dozen running, and then a handful, and then silence. Real silence, the kind that has texture after so much noise. And in that silence, 650 people got off their bikes and began doing what they had apparently come prepared to do. 3 pickup trucks had been following the formation at the back. Hank hadn't noticed them in the initial arrival. He'd been focused on the bikes on Sterling, on Silas. But now those trucks pulled forward into the driveway and their beds were full. Tools, lumber, bags of concrete, rolls of fencing wire, a generator, 2 chainsaws, cases of food, real food, the kind that required cooking, not the courtesy gesture of a casserole on a doorstep. And people who immediately began sorting through what they'd brought with the organized efficiency of a group that has coordinated this before. Danny appeared at the base of the porch steps. "Your south fence is down in 3 places," he said. Not a question. He'd been walking the property while the confrontation was happening, apparently doing his own assessment. "The barn roof has a section on the east side that's not going to make it through another winter. Your water line to the stock tank is patched with something that's going to fail in the spring thaw." He looked up at Hank. "We've got people who know what they're doing with all 3 of those things. If that's okay with you." Hank stared at him. "You want to fix my fence?" "And your barn roof," Danny said. "And your water line." He paused. "And probably a few other things we'll find once we start looking." Hank opened his mouth and then closed it. He was not a man who found it easy to receive help. He had been giving it his whole life to Eleanor when she was sick, to neighbors when they needed it, to 19 strangers in a blizzard without a second thought, and the receiving of it was unfamiliar in a way that made him feel briefly exposed like a man caught without his coat. "Danny Wang," he said. "You don't have to go on, Hank," Danny said with the patient firmness of a man who has heard this sentence coming from a mile away. "We know we don't have to." He spread his hands, a simple gesture. "We want to." There was the word again, 3rd time. Each time it landed the same way, not as a gift, but as a statement of something fundamental about how some debts work. You don't repay them because you owe them. You repay them because the repaying is itself the point. Because some things that are done for you change what you understand about what human beings are capable of, and the only honest response to that understanding is to pass it forward in whatever form you have available. Okay, Hank said. It came out smaller than he intended. Danny nodded once. Okay, he agreed, and walked back down the steps. Within an hour, Hank's property had transformed into something that had no neat precedent in his experience. There were men on the barn roof. There were men at the south fence. There were men in the equipment shed who had found things wrong that Hank hadn't known were wrong. There were men in his kitchen, which startled him when he came inside for a glass of water. And then he understood that they were cooking not for themselves, but for everyone. The whole 650 pulling provisions from the truck beds and using his stove and a propane setup they'd brought themselves, and the smells coming out of that kitchen were extraordinary. He stood in the doorway and watched two men he didn't know navigate his kitchen with the confident ease of people who have cooked for crowds before, and he thought about Eleanor and what she would have said, and he couldn't quite hear her voice this time. Which happened sometimes. Some days she was very clear, and some days she was just a presence, warm and approximate. But he felt her anyway, felt her in the way the kitchen was full, and the farm was full, and the silence of the last 3 years was entirely comprehensively gone. Silas found him standing there and came to stand beside him. They looked at the kitchen together for a moment. You holding up? Silas asked. I don't know, Hank said honestly. I keep waiting to feel one specific thing, and it keeps being several things at once. Silas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but had the quality of recognition. Yeah, he said, that tracks. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to tell you something about that night in the barn. Hank looked at him. I was the worst off, Silas said. Of all 19, my core temp was the lowest. The paramedic told me later that another 30 minutes and it would have been a very different outcome. He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who doesn't speak about personal things easily. I remember waking up. I remember you being there with the soup. I remember trying to work out what had happened and not being able to because my brain wasn't running right yet. He stopped. And the thing I remember most clearly, clearer than the soup, clearer than the barn, clearer than anything, is your face. This old man's face, looking at me with no fear in it, no judgment. Just, you're going to be okay, that's all. Just, you're going to be okay. His voice had gone very level in the way voices go when a man is managing something that would prefer to come out differently. I have had a very complicated life, Mr. Lawson. I have had people look at me with a lot of different things in their faces. He looked at Hank directly. Nobody had ever looked at me like that before. Hank held his gaze. The kitchen sounds moved around them. Outside hammers and voices and the sound of men working in cold air. You were dying, Hank said. Of course I looked at you like that. Silas shook his head. You looked at me like I was worth saving, he said. Want the situation. Me, the man. A pause. A lot of people who've seen my patch don't make that distinction. Hank looked at him for a long moment. Everyone's worth saving, he said. It came out simply without weight, without the cadence of a moral position being stated. It came out the way true things come out when a man has held them long enough that they've stopped being beliefs and have become just facts. Silas looked at him. Something moved in his face that Hank didn't try to name. He just let it be there. A shout from outside, Danny's voice loud and sharp in the cold air. Hank, hey Hank, come out here. The tone of it cut through everything, not alarm exactly, but urgency, the voice of a man who has found something. Hank and Silas came off the porch together. Danny was standing at the edge of the driveway and he was holding something. As Hank got closer, he could see what it was, a recording device. Small black, the kind that clips onto a surface and runs passive. Found it on your fence post, Danny said. The one closest to the road. He turned it over in his hand. It's been here a while, few weeks by the rust on the clip. He looked at Hank. You have any idea, Sterling, Hank said. The word came out flat and certain. Danny nodded slowly. That's what I thought. He looked at Silas. Means he's been monitoring the property, which means he knew about the riders, Silas said. His voice had gone very quiet and very precise. He knew you had 19 Hells Angels at your farm for 4 days. He knew you knew us. He paused. He filed the order anyway. Danny looked at the device, and then at Hank, and then back at Silas. He thought that would make it easier, Danny said. Not harder. The three men stood with this for a moment. He thought people knowing you'd had us here would make you look worse, Silas said. Not better. He shook his head very slightly. He doesn't understand the first thing about what actually happened in that barn. Book had followed them out and was already photographing the device with his phone. This is actually very helpful, he said in the tone of a man whose concept of helpful encompasses things most people would not find pleasant. If that device has recorded anything related to his knowledge of the legal proceedings, it potentially constitutes illegal surveillance, which is a separate federal issue. He bagged the device carefully. Very helpful, he said again, and went back to his laptop. Hank stood in the cold and looked at the fence post where the device had been. He thought about the weeks since the riders left the nights on the porch, the 11 times reading the foreclosure notice, the list of things he would take when he had to go. He thought about being watched through all of it. Someone documenting his isolation, his grief, his ordinary daily life on a farm that was being taken from him by a man who was apparently watching on camera to make sure it went smoothly. There was something about this that hit him differently than the rest of it. Not the legal mechanics, not the fraudulent notary stamp, not even the scale of what Sterling had been doing to other families. It was the surveillance, the specific voyeuristic quality of being observed in your worst moments by someone who intended to use your weakness against you. It made him angry in a way the rest of it hadn't quite managed. Not hot anger, old anger. The anger of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has just found the thing that exhausted his patience. Silas, he said. Silas looked at him. However long it takes, Hank said. Whatever Book needs from me. He looked at the fence post. I want to see this done all the way. Silas studied him. All the way, he repeated. The 6 families, Hank said. All of them. Whatever is possible. Silas looked at him steadily for a moment. Then he said, That's going to take time. I have time, Hank said. I'm 67 and I'm healthy and this is my farm and I'm not going anywhere. Something that was almost a smile crossed Silas's face. No, he said, you're not. He turned to Danny. Call Book back out here and call Reyes, tell him we're going full scope on the filing. All 8 properties. Danny was already pulling his phone. The work continued around them. On the barn roof, men who had spent their lives working with their hands moved across the damaged section with a speed and competence that Hank couldn't help but admire. The south fence was coming back together, post by post. From the equipment shed came the particular sounds of machinery being correctly diagnosed and addressed. His farm, which had been dying slowly and quietly for 3 years, was loud with the sound of being fixed. Colt the rider and Hank had been most worried about that blizzard night. The one whose temperature had been lowest, who had taken the longest to respond, came and found Hank in the middle of the afternoon. He was a young man, maybe 28, with the build of someone who had worked hard outdoors his whole life. He stood in front of Hank with his hands in his jacket pockets and didn't say anything right away. Hank waited. I heard what you told Silas, Colt finally said, about everyone being worth saving. He looked down at the ground, then back up. I want you to know I don't take that for granted. I know what I am to most people. He said it without self-pity, but also without pretense, just the flat clarity of a man who has long since taken an honest accounting of how the world sees him. I know what it meant that you went back out in that storm. He stopped. I'm not going to say thank you because that doesn't cover it, but I want you to know that I know. Hank looked at him for a long moment. What are you going to do with it? He asked. Colt blinked. Sir, what you know, Hank said, about being worth saving. What are you going to do with that? Colt's brow furrowed. It was not a question he had been asked before. He thought about it genuinely, thought about it standing in the cold of a January afternoon on a farm he'd nearly died on the way to. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but something. Hank nodded. That's enough, he said. Something is always enough to start with. Colt looked at him with an expression that was very young and very old, at the same time the expression of a man in the early stages of deciding what kind of man he is going to be. Then he nodded once and walked back toward the barn. The afternoon light was going thin and blue by the time Book came back to the porch with his laptop and 2 other men Hank didn't know. One introduced as a paralegal named Steve, one as a financial forensics consultant named Marcus, which briefly produced a moment of terrible irony that everyone present registered and nobody mentioned. They spread documents across the porch railing, and for the next 2 hours, Hank sat in his father's chair and answered questions and signed things and listened as the shape of what Sterling had been doing unfolded in its full ugly dimension. It was not a small thing. What Book had spent 17 days building was a case that touched 43 properties, 11 counties, 3 states, and 2 federal loan programs. Sterling was not a lone bad actor. He was a mechanism, one part of a larger system designed to identify financially vulnerable agricultural landowners and accelerate their failure through a combination of legal pressure, document manipulation, and carefully cultivated relationships with county officials who were motivated to look the other way. The scale of it was staggering, and the more Hank understood of it, the more certain he became that without the accident of a blizzard and a phone number on a scrap of paper, he would have been one more quiet loss, the farm gone, the story untold, the machinery moving on to the next vulnerable person on the list. He thought about that. He sat in his father's chair with the legal documents in his lap, and he thought about the specific randomness of it. 19 men on the wrong road on the worst night of the year, and he thought about what his father would have said. Something about luck and what you do with it. Something about how the difference between a blessed life and an ordinary life is usually just what you choose to do with the accidents that happen to you. He had chosen to go out in a blizzard. He had chosen to drag men through the snow. He had chosen to give away his phone number. He had chosen this morning to sit on the porch and wait instead of running. And sitting there in the fading January light with 650 people working on his land and his barn and his fences, with a legal case taking shape that was going to take months and cost him things he couldn't fully anticipate. With Eleanor's photograph in his coat pocket and his father in the ground, 40 yards east, Henry Lawson understood something that he had known in pieces his whole life, but had never held all at once. The size of what a man gets back is always exactly determined by the size of what he was willing to give when nobody was watching. The porch light came on. Inside the kitchen, someone was still cooking. The smell of it came out through the door. Something good, something warm, and Hank sat in his father's chair and breathed it in, and the farm was alive around him, louder and more full of people than it had been in years, and he thought, Eleanor, you would not believe this day. He could have sworn he heard her laugh. The porch light burned through the night. Hank didn't sleep much, not because anything was wrong, in fact, because more things were right than had been right in years, and his body didn't know what to do with that. He lay in the bed that had been too wide for 3 years and listened to the sounds of the farm, and they were different sounds than he was used to. Low voices from somewhere outside, the occasional movement of a door, the distant clink of tools being sorted and packed. 650 people don't simply disappear at sundown. They settle, they organize, they make camp with the practiced efficiency of people who have spent their lives moving and stopping and moving again. Hank lay in the dark and listened to all of it and felt very strangely like a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time and has finally quietly exhaled. He was up at 4 anyway, old habit. He made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark and the shapes of bikes along the road and the orange glow of a fire someone had built in the field margin. A contained, responsible fire ringed with stones, the kind built by people who know what they're doing. Around it, figures, men talking low, drinking coffee of their own, the red points of cigarettes moving in the dark. He watched them and thought about what Eleanor would have made of this specific image, the Montana January dark, the fire, the bikers, and he decided she would have found it beautiful. She had always found beauty in unexpected arrangements of things. It was one of the specific qualities he missed most, the way she could look at something ordinary or strange and find the light in it. He poured a second cup and put on his coat and went outside. Nobody made a production of him appearing. A few heads turned, a few nods. One man, Hank didn't know his name yet, would learn it was Pete, 20 years with the club, originally from Mississippi, held up a coffee thermos in silent inquiry, and Hank held up his own mug to indicate he was covered, and Pete nodded and went back to the conversation he had been having. Hank stood near the fire and drank his coffee and let the warmth of it settle into his hands and looked up at the Montana sky, which on a clear January night is one of the great unreasonable beauties of the physical world. Silas appeared beside him without announcement, The way Silas seemed to move through every situation present before you noticed the transition from absent. He had a mug too. They stood at the fire for a moment without speaking. You sleep, Silas asked. Some, Hank said. You, never much, Silas said. He looked up at the same sky. Book's been working since 2, he said. He does that when he's close to something. Is he close to something? He thinks the surveillance device connects Sterling directly to the county assessor's office, Silas said. There are recorded conversations Sterling didn't sweep the device, which is the kind of mistake arrogant men make. He put it on your fence to monitor you and forgot to think about what it was also recording when he was standing near it. He paused. 3 conversations. Sterling and a man named Garrett the assessor who signed off on the undervalued appraisals, discussing specific properties, specific timelines, discussing you by name 3 weeks ago. He looked at Hank, discussing the bikers. What Sterling called and I want you to know, I'm quoting here what he called a, quote, useful liability, unquote. Hank looked at him. He was planning to use the fact that we were here against you, Silas said, with the bank, with the county, possibly in court. The suggestion being that a man who voluntarily housed known criminal elements on his property was not a trustworthy steward of. He stopped, shook his head. It's the kind of thinking that only makes sense to someone who has never once in his life done anything because it was right. He genuinely cannot conceive of it as a motive. Hank looked into the fire. He was quiet for a long moment. He almost won, he said. Silas looked at him. He had the papers. He had the judge. He had the sheriff and the bulldozer. If your people hadn't come, but we did, Silas said. Because you gave me that phone number, Hank said. Because one of your members set up an alert. Because a series of things happened in a specific order that didn't have to happen that way. He looked at Silas. I'm not complaining. I'm just sitting with how close it was. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my father used to say that close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. Hank looked at him. Mine said the same thing, he said. The 2 men looked at each other across the fire. Then Hank said, where is your father? And Silas said, gone, 15 years. And Hank said, I'm sorry. And Silas said he would have liked you. And neither of them said anything after that for a while because some conversations are in their silence. Book came off the porch at 5:45 with his laptop in the expression of a man who has found exactly what he was looking for and is not entirely surprised but is deeply professionally satisfied. He walked straight to Silas and held the laptop up. 3 conversations. Total runtime 42 minutes. Sterling is on 26 of those minutes. The assessor is on all 42. The content, he paused and the pause was theatrical but earned, is comprehensive. Conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, because some of these conversations cross state lines, abuse of office for the assessor, and he scrolled one conversation that explicitly discusses how to time the foreclosure proceedings to avoid triggering the 60-day federal review requirement under the Agricultural Loan Protection Act. He looked up. That last one is federal. That's not a state filing. That goes to the U.S. attorney. Hank, who had come over when he saw Book emerge, looked at the screen. He couldn't follow all of it. The legal language was dense and specific, but he understood the shape. He understood that what had been done to him and to the 6 other families had been deliberate and coordinated and covered with just enough legal varnish to look clean from a distance. He understood that what Book had found was the thing under the varnish. How long, he said, until something actually happens, until Sterling is actually held accountable. How long does that realistically take? Book considered the question honestly. Federal investigations move slowly, he said. 18 months minimum before any criminal charges. Civil recovery for the affected families could start sooner, 6 to 8 months, with the right filings. Your property, he looked at Hank, your property we can get cleared within 30 days. The court order is voided the moment we file the fraud documentation with the district judge, which I plan to do when the courthouse opens at 8 this morning. Hank nodded slowly, and Sterling Book looked at him over the laptop. Marcus Sterling is going to spend the next several years of his life in very expensive legal trouble, he said. I can't promise you prison. I won't do that. but I can promise you that he will never do this to another family. The license, the network, the relationships, all of it ends here." He paused. "The 47 properties he's done this to, we will go back through every one. Every family that can be reached will be contacted. Every case that shows the same pattern gets added to the filing." He closed the laptop. "This is not a small case anymore, Hank. This is the case." Hank looked at him. He thought about something to say and didn't find it. So he did the only thing that seemed proportionate to the moment he put out his hand. Book took it and they shook. And the handshake had the weight of something that was going to matter for a long time to a lot of people who weren't standing at this fire. By 7 in the morning, the property was moving again. What had begun as a show of force and then evolved into a work party had now taken on a third quality, something organized, purposeful, almost institutional in its coordination. Book had set up what he called a field office at Hank's kitchen table, with 2 other men running laptops on either side of him, a printer that had appeared from somewhere operating on an extension cord, and a steady stream of people coming in and out with documents. Silas had taken 3 calls before breakfast, each one from a different state, and after each call, he had added something to the information on Book's table. The network that had been building for 17 days was accelerating now, fed by the specific momentum of a situation that had moved from theoretical to active. Danny came to find Hank just after 7. He had been up all night. The circles under his eyes were comprehensive, but he was moving with the focused energy of a man running on purpose rather than sleep. "I need to show you something," he said. He walked Hank out to the south barn. Inside, 4 men were working on the east wall, structural damage that Hank had known about for 2 years and had not been able to afford to address. But that wasn't what Danny wanted to show him. He led Hank to the north end of the barn, where a table had been set up, 2 sawhorses, and a sheet of plywood, and on the table were papers. Not legal documents, plans, hand-drawn plans detailed and careful for the barn roof repair, the fence line restoration, the water system fix, and 3 other things Hank hadn't even put on his mental list yet. Next to the plans was a handwritten accounting of materials, what had been brought, what still needed to be sourced, estimated timeline. "Who did this?" Hank asked. Danny pointed to a man in the corner of the barn who was measuring something with a tape and writing the numbers on his forearm. "His name is Victor," Danny said. "He was a general contractor for 20 years before he retired and joined the club. He walked the property yesterday afternoon and drew all of this up last night." Hank looked at the plans. They were professional, the kind of thing an architect's office would produce translated into the practical language of someone who had spent decades actually building things. Victor had identified the barn's structural issues with the precision of someone who understood buildings the way a doctor understands bodies. He had prioritized them correctly. He had sourced materials from 3 suppliers in the region with prices and quantities noted. He had scheduled the work across 3 days, accounting for available labor and temperature windows. It was objectively an extraordinary piece of work done by a man who'd had 1 afternoon and 1 night and had apparently needed neither. Hank walked over to Victor. The man looked up from his measuring. He was compact and dark-haired, mid-50s, with hands that showed decades of tool use. "This is good work," Hank said, gesturing at the plans. Victor shrugged in the way of a man who does not see the need to thank someone for telling him water is wet. "It's a good barn," he said, "worth fixing correctly." He looked at Hank with the appraising eye of someone who sees structures and immediately wants to know their history. "When was the south wall built?" "Different materials from the rest." 1989, Hank said. "I added the south section after a bad winter took out the original." Victor nodded. "Good work," he said with the same tone Hank had just used returning the compliment, acknowledging a fellow craftsman. "Whoever built it knew what they were doing." "I built it," Hank said. Victor looked at him. "Then you know what good work looks like," he said. "So you know why I'm fixing this correctly." He went back to his measuring. Hank stood there for a moment, quietly moved in a way he couldn't entirely explain, and then walked back to Danny. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. Danny looked at him. "Do what?" "Receive all of this," Hank said. "I've been the person who helps my whole life. I'm not practiced at this side of it." Danny looked at him with a steadiness that was surprisingly gentle for a man of his size and history. "Nobody is," he said. "You just let it happen. You don't have to manage it. You don't have to balance the books on it. You just let it happen and let it be what it is. He paused. Can you do that? Hank thought about it honestly. I can try, he said. Good enough, Danny said. At 8:15, Book filed the fraud documentation with the district court in Helena via electronic submission. At 8:43, the court issued an automatic stay on all proceedings related to the Lawson property pending review, which meant that even if Sterling drove back down that road with a new order and a different bulldozer, he could not legally touch the farm. Book received the confirmation on his laptop and walked out to the porch where Hank was standing with his coffee and said simply, "It's done. Legally, the farm is yours again." Hank looked at him. He looked at the farm, the fields, the barn with men working on it, the fence line being rebuilt in the cold January morning. He looked at the east field where the split hickory stood. He looked at all of it, and then quietly and without apparent self-consciousness, he pressed his lips together and looked up at the sky and breathed out a long, slow breath that turned to white vapor in the cold air. Book stood beside him and let him have the moment. "Thank you," Hank said when he was ready. Not just to Book, to all of it, to the strange, improbable chain of events that had carried him from the edge to this porch on this morning. "Don't thank me," Book said. "Thank whoever decided to ride into that blizzard 3 weeks ago. Without them, I'm just an attorney who nobody's calling." Hank smiled at that, the first full smile, not the controlled expression he'd been managing since 4 in the morning, but a real one, the kind that reaches the eyes and changes the whole architecture of a face. It looked good on him. It looked like something that had been waiting for permission. The call came at 9:20. Hank's regular phone, not the burner, his actual phone, and the number was a Montana area code he didn't recognize. He answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman mid-60s by the sound of it, and she was crying before she said a single word. He waited. "Mr. Lawson," she said. "My name is Ruth Kavanaugh. I had a farm outside of Browning. Sterling, his company, they took it 14 months ago." She stopped, gathered herself. "A man named Book called my daughter last night. He told her," she stopped again. "He told her that you're helping to try to get it back." A silence. "I don't know you," she said. "I don't know why you would do this. I don't understand why a stranger would—" "Mrs. Kavanaugh," Hank said. His voice was very even and very warm. "How long was your family on that land?" She made a sound, not quite a word more, the sound of someone for whom a question has hit a place that can't be addressed with language. Then, "My grandfather built the house in 1931, she said, "during the Depression. He built it because he had nothing else and he needed something to be true." Hank closed his eyes briefly. "I know exactly what that means," he said. "You're going to hear from Book again today. He's going to need some information from you, documents, dates, anything you still have. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. "Yes, we can do that." "Then why are you doing this?" Hank thought about the honest answer. "Because I almost lost mine," he said, "and someone showed up for me when I needed it. That's not something you keep. That's something you pass on." A long silence on the line. Then Ruth Kavanaugh said very quietly, "God bless you, Mr. Lawson." Hank held the phone for a moment after the call ended. He sat with the weight of it, the farm outside Browning, the grandfather who built a house during the Depression, because he needed something to be true. He thought about his own father. He thought about the hickory in the East Field. He thought about the word true and what it meant in the specific context of land that has been in a family for generations. How it becomes true in the way that nothing purchased or rented or borrowed can ever quite be. How it becomes woven into the identity of the people who work it until the boundary between the family and the land is something more metaphorical than physical. He went to find Book. Book was already on the phone with someone, but he held up a hand when he saw Hank's expression and wrapped the call in 30 seconds. "Ruth Kavanaugh," Hank said. Book nodded. "I spoke to her daughter last night. The Browning property is one of the clearest cases outside of yours." He pulled up something on the laptop. The appraisal on that property was undervalued by 38%. The documentation irregularities are, he turned the laptop here. Same notary stamp in 2 places. Different dates, but Judith Marlin's seal on both. Hank looked at the screen. "She gets her farm back." Book met his eyes. "I'm going to do everything in my power to make that happen," he said. "I won't promise you a timeline, but yes, she gets her farm back." He said it with the weight of a man making a commitment, not a prediction. Hank held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once and went back outside. At 11 o'clock, a car Hank didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. This created a brief, immediate alertness among the riders nearest the road. Not aggression, just attention, the instinctive vigilance of a community that has learned to notice who arrives and how. The car was a county vehicle. Hank recognized the markings before it stopped. Two men got out. Neither was Pruitt. One was in a suit. One was in a state police uniform. They came toward the porch with the careful deliberateness of officials who are not entirely sure of their welcome. The man in the suit introduced himself as Thomas Reardon, an investigator with the Montana Department of Justice. The state trooper was there, he explained simply, as protocol. They had been, he said, following developments in Glacier County for approximately 3 weeks related to First Continental Agricultural's foreclosure practices. They had been, he said, in contact with Book's office. They had been, he said, waiting for a complainant with sufficient documentation to formalize a state-level investigation. He looked at Hank steadily. "We understand you are willing to cooperate," he said. "We'd like to talk." Hank looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way he'd learned to read people over 67 years, looking for the thing behind the official manner, the thing that told you whether the official manner was a cover for something else or was simply the way this particular person had learned to present themselves in professional situations. What he found in Reardon was someone who was genuinely angry, not at Hank, at Sterling, at the system that had allowed Sterling. The anger was controlled and professional and had been channeled into the specific purpose of state investigation. But it was there. "Come inside," Hank said. "I'll put on coffee." The meeting with Reardon lasted 2 hours. Book sat in and translated between the legal frameworks, and Silas sat in a corner chair and said nothing the entire time, but was present in the specific way that made everyone in the room aware that the conversation had a witness who remembered everything. Reardon's questions were thorough and precise and sometimes difficult. He needed Hank to walk through the entire timeline, from the first loan, restructuring to the foreclosure notice, to the morning's events, and there were places in that timeline where Hank had to go to places he hadn't fully examined out loud. The conversation with Sterling 2 months ago, when Hank had been offered the voluntary surrender arrangement, the night he had first understood that the legal fees and penalties had grown beyond any realistic possibility of repayment, the morning he had read the foreclosure notice for the 11th time. These were private things, the internal geography of a man's loss, and saying them out loud in a kitchen to a state investigator was its own kind of difficult. But he did it. He answered every question directly and completely. Silas watched from the corner chair and never said a word. When Reardon finished, he closed his notebook and looked at Hank. "I need to ask you something off the record," he said. Hank waited. "The bikers," Reardon said. "The club. The presence here today." He chose his words carefully. "In our investigation, we have not identified any illegal activity on the club's part in relation to this situation. Everything they have done appears to be," he paused, "entirely within legal limits. The document researched the attorney filings, the physical presence today." He looked at Hank. "What I want to understand, and this is genuinely personal curiosity, not official inquiry, is how this happened. How does a 67-year-old Montana farmer end up with 650 Hells Angels on his land, voluntarily fixing his barn?" Hank considered the question. It was at its core the same question Danny had asked in the barn at 2 a.m. It was the same question his own mind had been turning over since Saturday. The honest answer was simple and probably unsatisfying in the way that simple, honest answers always are to people who are looking for something more complicated. "I went out in a blizzard," and he said, "and I brought people in out of the cold because they were going to die if I didn't." He looked at Reardon. "That's the whole story." Reardon looked at him. "People don't do that," he said. "For strangers. People drive past." "Some do," Hank said. "I didn't." Reardon studied him for a moment with the expression of a man who has spent his career investigating the worst that people do to each other and has just encountered, unexpectedly, the best. He nodded once. Then he put on his coat and picked up his briefcase and shook Hank's hand and said, "Mr. Lawson, I'll be in touch," and walked out. The state trooper followed, giving Silas a look on the way out that was not quite a nod, but was close. Silas returned it. The kitchen exhaled. "That went well," Book said. He'll open the state investigation within a week. Reardon is thorough, and he's been wanting something like this for a while. He closed his laptop. The federal piece I'm going to push to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Billings. I have a contact there. We went to law school together. She's been working agricultural fraud cases for 6 years. She's going to be very interested. He looked at Hank. This is moving faster than I expected. Is that good? Hank asked. It's very good, Book said. Sterling doesn't know yet how fast it's moving. That matters. When someone is the subject of an investigation they don't know about, they make choices they wouldn't make if they were being careful. They move money. They make calls. Every move and every call becomes evidence. He paused. I want Sterling moving for as long as possible before he understands what's happening. Hank thought about that. He's going to figure it out, he said. Eventually. Yes, Book said, but by then the documentation will be complete. He closed the laptop with finality. He built his career on the assumption that the people he was doing this to had no recourse. No money for attorneys, no connections, no leverage. He was right about all of that. He looked at Hank. He just didn't account for what happens when someone does something genuinely decent in front of the right people. He paused. Or the wrong people from his perspective. The afternoon brought something Hank had not expected. Around 2 o'clock, Danny came to find him again, and this time he was not alone. Behind him were 6 men Hank had not specifically spoken to, yet 6 riders from different chapters, different states, different apparent histories. They ranged in age from maybe 25 to over 60. They arranged themselves in a rough semicircle in front of the porch steps in a way that was not confrontational, but was clearly organized, clearly intentional. Danny stood at the front. These men asked if they could talk to you, Danny said, individually, not about the legal stuff, about, he paused, looking for the right word, about other things. Hank looked at the 6 men. He looked at their faces. Each one of them had the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has decided in this specific moment, and for reasons they might not fully be able to articulate, that they would like to put it down. Okay, Uati, he said, one at a time. And for the next 2 hours in a conversation that Hank would never fully describe to anyone because it belonged to those men and not to any story, he sat on his porch and listened. Not to legal information, not to logistics, not to plans. He listened to men talk about their lives, about fathers they'd lost or never had, about choices that couldn't be undone, about the specific gravity of belonging to something that the world had decided to fear without ever looking carefully at what was actually inside it. He listened the way he had always listened, without agenda, without the urge to fix or redirect, just fully present, the way his father had taught him that real listening worked. One of the men, the oldest gray-bearded from a Wyoming chapter, said at the end of his time on the porch steps, I don't know why I'm telling you this. And Hank said, sometimes people tell you things because you're the first person who seemed like you'd actually hear them. The old biker looked at him for a long time. Then he said, yeah, that's it exactly. And he got up and walked back to his bike. When the last of the 6 had gone, Hank sat alone on the porch for a few minutes in the early dark of the January afternoon. He was tired in a way that was not unpleasant, the tiredness of a day that had required everything he had and had given back more. He looked at the farm. The fence was almost done. The barn roof section was complete. Victor had walked him through it at lunchtime, showing him the work with the quiet, professional pride of a craftsman who has done something correctly and wants someone to understand why. The water line to the stock tank was repaired and tested. 3 other things he hadn't known needed doing had been done. His farm was more solid than it had been in 3 years. And tomorrow, Book would be in Helena filing documents, and Reardon would be opening an investigation, and Ruth Kavanaugh, outside of Browning, would be talking to someone who could help her understand what had happened to her grandfather's house, and Marcus Sterling, somewhere tonight in whatever clean hotel he used when he worked rural Montana counties, Marcus Sterling was going to start receiving information that would make the quality of his sleep change in a fundamental and permanent way. Silas came and sat in the other chair. Eleanor's chair, the one that had sat empty for 3 years, that nobody sat in because it was hers, and the absence of her in it was its own kind of presence. He sat in it without knowing its history, and Hank watched him do it and felt something shift. Not a loss, something more like a door opening, like the farm itself deciding that the period of suspended animation was over. You need to eat something, Silas said. I ate at noon, Hank said. It's 5 o'clock, Silas said, and you've been on this porch for 2 hours. He looked at Hank sideways. You're the worst at being taken care of. I told Danny that, Hank said. I'm not practiced at it. Then practice, Silas said. He stood up. Come inside. The men made dinner. Real dinner, not, he gestured vaguely, not whatever you would have made for yourself. Hank looked up at him. What did they make? Something with brisket, Silas said. Victor apparently cooks the same way he builds things, thoroughly and without shortcuts. Hank considered that. That sounds like it might be good, he said. It's extraordinary, Silas said, which is annoying because now I have to admit that Victor is good at two things instead of just one. He said it with a completely flat delivery that Hank had come to understand was his version of dry humor. No smile, no change in inflection, just the words left for the other person to find the funny in. Hank found it. He laughed real genuine, the same quality of laugh that Danny had produced in the kitchen 3 weeks ago, the laugh that surprises a man because it comes from somewhere that has been sealed off for a while. He got up out of his father's chair and followed Silas inside. Behind him, the farm held its ground in the January dark. The fence was mended. The barn was sound. The land was legally, formally, finally his. And somewhere in the document chain that Book had built over 17 days, the mechanism of justice was moving slowly as justice always does, but moving fed by the specific and irreplaceable fuel of truth, told by people who had nothing to gain from telling it, except the satisfaction of having done the right thing. Hank Lawson walked into his kitchen and sat down at his own table and let 650 people feed him dinner in his own house, and the strangeness of it was complete, imperfect, and entirely right. The brisket was in fact extraordinary. Victor had cooked it low and slow in a Dutch oven on Hank's stove with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the best things cannot be rushed. Not buildings, not trust, not meat. The kitchen that had been quiet for 3 years was so full that people spilled into the hallway and the living room plates balanced on knees and windowsills. The conversation layered and loud and warm, in the specific way that a house full of people who have worked hard together all day gets warm. Hank sat at the head of his own table, his father's table, the same one that had been in this kitchen since 1974, and ate the best meal he'd had since Eleanor died and didn't say much and didn't need to. Silas sat to his left, Danny to his right. Book was across the table with a plate he kept forgetting to eat from because he kept picking up his phone and then putting it down and picking it up again with the restless energy of a man waiting for something specific to land. At 8:17, it landed. He picked up the phone, read whatever was on the screen, and set it back down with a deliberateness that was different from the previous times, the deliberateness of arrival rather than anticipation. He looked at Silas. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Billings acknowledged receipt of the preliminary filing, he said. My contact confirmed they're opening a review. He paused. She also said, and she's not someone who says things she doesn't mean, she said, this is the cleanest predatory fraud package she's seen in 6 years of agricultural cases. The table went quiet in the immediate radius of that statement, the quiet spreading outward as people registered the shift in Book's face. Danny looked at Hank. Hank looked at his plate. He put his fork down and looked at the table for a moment, at the grain of the wood his father had chosen in 1974, at the small burn mark near the corner that had been there since Hank was 9 years old and had set a hot pan down without thinking. He had eaten thousands of meals at this table. He had done homework at this table. He had sat at this table the night his father told him the farm would one day be his. He had sat at this table the night Eleanor told him about the diagnosis. He had sat at this table alone every night for 3 years with canned soup and the sound of a house that had learned to be quiet. He had almost lost this table. He had almost lost everything it carried. He pressed his palm flat against the wood and held it there for a second, and then he picked his fork back up. Good, he said, and went back to eating. Nobody pushed for more than that. That was one of the things Hank was beginning to understand about these men. They had a very accurate sense of when a moment was complete. They didn't expand, it didn't perform around, it didn't ask him to narrate his own feelings for the room's benefit. They let it be what it was and moved on the way people move on when they have enough of their own history with hard moments to know that some of them need space more than they need attention. Conversation resumed. Someone made a joke Hank half caught. Victor accepted a compliment about the brisket with the same expression he'd used when Hank complimented the barnwork, factual acknowledgement, nothing more. Colt, the youngest, was talking to an older man across the room about something that sounded like engines, but might have been something else entirely. And Hank sat in the middle of all of it and let it happen around him, and felt for the first time in 3 years that a house full of noise was not an intrusion but a restoration. The riders who had come from farthest away began leaving the next morning, Sunday in waves, small groups peeling off the formation throughout the day, engines starting in the cold handshakes and nods on the driveway, the casual farewell vocabulary of people who see each other with regularity and are not burdened with the weight of goodbyes. A man from the Texas chapter, enormous, gentle-voiced, had spent most of Saturday quietly repairing Hank's tractor with 2 other men, and had never once mentioned it, shook Hank's hand on his way out and held it for a long moment. "My grandmother had a farm," he said, "outside Amarillo. Lost it when I was 12. Bank took it." He looked at Hank steadily. "I've thought about that my whole life, what I would have done if someone had showed up." He released Hank's hand. "Now I know," he said. He walked to his bike and was gone. That was Sunday, and then Tuesday, and then 2 weeks, and then 6 months, and the shape of things changed the way the shape of things always changes when a story leaves its crisis point and enters its long, unspectacular aftermath, which is where most of the real work happens and where most stories stop being told, because the aftermath doesn't have the compression and urgency of the crisis, doesn't have Sterling in the yard or 600 engines on the road, and requires a different kind of attention to see what's actually occurring. What was occurring was this book filed the formal federal complaint on a Wednesday morning in February, and by the following Monday, Marcus Sterling had been contacted by the U.S. Attorney's Office and informed that he was the subject of a federal investigation into agricultural fraud and conspiracy. Hank got a call from Book that afternoon. "He's retained a criminal defense attorney," Book said. "The good kind, which means he's taking this seriously." He paused. He should be taking this seriously. The first civil recovery motion specifically for the Kavanaugh property outside of Browning was filed in the same week, and the judge assigned to the case had a reputation that Book described as someone who takes land fraud personally, which was not a legal characterization but was apparently the relevant one. Ruth Kavanaugh called Hank when she got the news about the filing. She was crying again, but differently from the first time. The first time she had cried with the exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a loss for too long. This time she cried the way people cry when something they had stopped allowing themselves to hope for when it suddenly becomes possible again. She kept saying, "I don't understand how this is happening." And Hank kept saying, "It's happening because people showed up." And she kept saying, "But why?" And he kept saying, "Because that's what people do when they're given the chance." And he believed it completely. He believed it because 6 weeks ago he had been the one who couldn't understand why. And now he was on the other side of that question, and the answer was the same from every direction. People show up because someone showed them that showing up is possible. Silas called every Sunday. Not a long call. Silas was not a long call person, had no patience for conversation that extended beyond its necessary length. But he called. He would give Hank a brief update on whatever he knew about the legal situation, and Hank would give him a brief update on the farm, and then there would be a few minutes of something that wasn't quite small talk, but was the comfortable ambient conversation of 2 people who have established that they trust each other and are simply keeping the line warm. Danny texted more frequently. Danny was a texter, had the thumbs of a much younger man, sent information in short bursts throughout the week. Victor had gone back to Colorado, but sent Hank a detailed written maintenance schedule for everything he'd worked on, typed up properly with seasonal notes delivered by actual mail in an envelope, which was the most Victor thing Hank could imagine. Colt called once 3 weeks after everything on a Thursday evening. Hank almost didn't answer because he didn't recognize the number. "It's Colt," the young man said when Hank picked up. "From I was in the barn, the blizzard, the one you asked what I was going to do with, knowing I was worth saving." Hank remembered. "I remember," he said. "I'm in school," Colt said. He said it the way a man says something he's slightly embarrassed about, but is also deeply committed to a combination of vulnerability and determination. "Community college. Billings. I started 3 weeks ago." A pause. "I wanted to tell you." Hank sat with that for a moment. "What are you studying?" he asked. "Electrical," Colt said. "Electrician program. 2 years." Another pause. "I've always been good with wiring. On bikes, I figured—" He stopped. "I figured I could be good at it for buildings too." Hank thought about Colt on the porch steps mid-20s, that expression of a man in the early stages of deciding what kind of man he would be. "That's the something," Hank said. "Sir, you told me you'd do something with it. You said you didn't know what yet, but something." Hank's voice was steady and warm. "That's the something." A very long silence on the line. Then Colt said, "Yeah," in a voice that was one syllable and contained a great deal more than one syllable's worth of meaning. "Yeah, I guess it is." March brought the first real break in the Sterling case. Garrett, the county assessor whose name and voice had been captured on Sterling's own surveillance device, discussing the fraud in precise and incriminating detail, agreed to cooperate with the U.S. Attorney's Office in exchange for a reduced charge. Book called Hank when it happened. "He's giving them everything," Book said. "The methodology, the network, the financial flows. Every property, every falsified appraisal, every payment." He paused. "There were payments, Hank. Garrett was receiving $12,000 per property. Sterling's network processed 19 properties with falsified appraisals. That's $228,000 in bribes." Hank was quiet. He thought about what $228,000 represented in the lives of the families who'd lost their land. He thought about Ruth Kavanaugh's grandfather building a house during the Depression because he needed something to be true. He thought about the 6 families who'd lost their land before Sterling got to him, and the 40 more that Garrett was now accounting for across the network. "What happens now?" he said. "Sterling's attorney is going to recommend he cooperate too," Book said. "He doesn't have a choice. Garrett's cooperation is comprehensive. The federal case is solid. Sterling cooperating is the difference between 7 years and 22. He paused. "He'll cooperate. And when he does, the civil recovery filings for all the affected properties get accelerated because the fraud is established by the criminal proceeding." He let Hank process that. "We're going to get them their land back," he said. "Maybe not all of them. Some have been resold, which complicates recovery. But there are remedies for that too. But most of them get their land back." Hank pressed his palm flat on the kitchen table again. "Same place as always. The burn mark from when he was 9. "Thank you," he said for the second time to Book. "Still not me," Book said. "Still the blizzard." April brought something Hank had not anticipated at all. It came in the form of a call from a newspaper, a regional paper out of Great Falls, which had been following the Sterling case as it developed through the court system. A reporter named Claire Hendricks Young, by her voice, had been covering agricultural fraud cases for 2 years and had identified the Lawson situation as the origin point of the federal investigation. She wanted to interview Hank. He said he'd think about it. He called Silas. "What do you think?" "I think your story is yours to tell or not tell," Silas said. "But if you tell it, other people who are in the same situation Sterling was putting you in get a name for what's happening to them. They get a number to call. They get the knowledge that there's a case." He paused. "That's worth something." Hank thought about it for 2 days. Then he called Claire Hendricks back and said yes. The interview took 3 hours at Hank's kitchen table. Claire was thorough and careful and took notes by hand, which Hank appreciated. There was something about a person who still wrote things down on paper that told him something about how they thought. She asked about the blizzard. She asked about Sterling. She asked about Book in the investigation. She asked about the other families. And at the end, she asked the question Hank had known was coming since the first minute. "Why did you do it? 19 strangers in a blizzard. Why?" Hank looked at his hands. He thought about all the times this question had come at him in one form or another over the past months. From Danny, from Silas, from Reardon, from Ruth Kavanaugh. He had given honest answers every time, but they had felt each time slightly incomplete, like a word he kept reaching for, that kept being a few letters short of what he actually meant. He thought about his father. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about the 11 times he'd read the foreclosure notice in the way the ground had shaken before he could hear the engines. He thought about Colt in the electrical program in Billings. He thought about the burn mark on the table and the hickory in the east field and the soup in the blue sleeping bag. And then he said it the complete version, finally the one that had all the letters, "My wife Eleanor died 3 years ago. And when she died, I thought I genuinely believed that the measure of a life was the things you built. The barn, the fence, the farm, the physical things you could point to." He paused. "But that night in the blizzard, I wasn't thinking about the barn or the fence. I wasn't thinking about anything except that there were people dying on my land, and I was the only one there." He looked at Claire steadily. "And what I understood that night, what I've been understanding more clearly every day since, is that the barn doesn't matter. The fence doesn't matter. The farm," he paused, "even the farm doesn't matter. Not the way I thought it did. What matters is what you do when someone needs you and you're the only one there. Because how you answer that question is the only true thing about you. Everything else is just property." Claire stopped writing. She looked up from her notepad. She was young enough that she hadn't yet learned to keep her face completely still when something landed, and what was on her face was the expression of someone who has just been handed something they are going to carry for a long time. "That's," she started, and then stopped. "Can I use that?" she said. "All of it." "That's why you're here," Hank said. The story ran in May. Front page of the Great Falls Tribune, continued inside with a photograph of Hank on his porch that Claire had taken on her phone, not a professional shot, just natural light, and an old man in a wool cap in the chair that had been his father's. The headline read, "The Farmer Who Saved 19 Bikers and Why 650 Came Back." It was picked up by the Associated Press within 48 hours. By the end of the week, it had run in newspapers in 31 states. The following week, 3 television networks called. Hank declined all 3 and called Silas. "The networks want interviews," he said. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd call them back," Hank said. Silas was quiet for a moment. "You know, if you do it, it accelerates the civil cases," he said. "Media attention on Sterling makes the federal timeline move faster. Prosecutors like cases that people are watching." "I know," Hank said. "That's why I'm calling you." Another silence. "It's your call," Silas said. "Always your call." Hank looked at his kitchen. He looked at the burn mark. "I'll do one," he said. "One interview. In this kitchen. With Eleanor's recipe box on the counter." He paused. "And they leave when I say they leave." Silas said, "I'll tell Book. He'll want to be there." "He's always welcome," Hank said. And the interview ran on a Thursday morning, and 17 million people watched it, and in the comments section of every platform where it posted, among the hundreds of thousands of responses, were 2 that Hank would eventually be shown and that he would read once and then set aside because they were not for public consumption, but were privately completely true. One was from a woman in Browning, Montana, who wrote, "My grandmother is getting her farm back. I didn't think that was possible anymore. Thank you, Mr. Lawson." The other was from a username that Hank recognized as one of the writer's handles. He'd seen it on Danny's phone, and it said only, "This is what a man looks like." June came in warm, and with it, the first formal court ruling in the Kavanaugh civil recovery case. The judge, the one with the personal relationship to land fraud, ruled that the foreclosure on the Kavanaugh property had been executed through fraudulent documentation, that the title transfer was void, and that ownership reverted to Ruth Kavanaugh as the legitimate heir of the original landholder. Book called Hank from outside the courthouse in Helena, and Hank could hear something in his voice that he'd never heard there before. Not excitement exactly, but the particular warmth of a man whose professional capabilities have been applied to something that genuinely matters and has produced the intended result. "She was there," Book said, "in the courtroom. I didn't know she was coming. She showed up." He paused. "When the judge read the ruling, she made a sound. I've been in a lot of courtrooms, Hank. I've never heard a sound like that." Hank sat in his father's chair on the porch and held the phone and let that settle into him. Ruth Kavanaugh in a courtroom in Helena, making a sound that a veteran attorney had never heard before. A grandfather's house built during the Depression because he needed something to be true, coming back to his family. "What happens next for her?" he said. "The property has been maintained. Sterling's company kept it up because they were planning to sell it commercially, which actually works in her favor. She can move back in immediately." Book's voice was steady but warm. "She told me she's going to plant a garden this summer. First thing, before she unpacks." Hank smiled. It was Eleanor's kind of thing. Plant the garden first, let the house sort itself out around the growing. "Good, Pete," he said. "That's exactly right." The summer moved. Sterling cooperated with the federal investigation in July, as Book had predicted a comprehensive cooperation agreement that confirmed everything Garrett had said and added operational details that expanded the case from 43 properties to 61. The plea agreement was announced in August. 31 months in federal prison restitution payments to all affected parties, permanent disbarment from any financial services or real estate work. His network, the two law firms, the title company, the three appraisers faced separate proceedings that would take another year to resolve. Hank read the announcement in the Tribune and put the paper down on the kitchen table and sat for a moment with the completeness of it. He had not wanted Sterling in prison the way some people want punishment, not from revenge, not from satisfaction. He wanted it because the only honest response to what Sterling had done to 61 families was a consequence proportionate to the damage. And 31 months was not generous, but it was real and it was documented, and it would follow Marcus Sterling out the other side of that door. He thought about the 47 properties Sterling had completed before Hank's. He thought about all the people who had had no blizzard, no phone number, no chain of accidents leading to 650 engines. He thought about them and he felt a grief that was specific and honest, and then he let it do what grief does when you face it directly. It moved through him and left something behind that wasn't sorrow but was a kind of resolve. He picked up his phone and called Book. "The other families," he said, "the 47 from before, the ones we couldn't help with civil recovery because the statute limitations." "I've been thinking about that," Book said. "There may be a path through the Federal Restitution Fund. It's not property recovery. Most of those can't be undone but financial remediation. I want to explore it." "Explore it," Hank said. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes." "It won't cost you anything," Book said. "We worked this one for the same reason we worked yours." He paused. "Because we want to." There it was, again, still, the word that had been running through the whole story like a current under still water. The word that was the answer to every version of why. October brought the planning meeting that Hank had not initiated, but had agreed to host when Danny called and said, "We have an idea and we need your kitchen table." He had said that with complete confidence, as if Hank's kitchen table had already become common property, which Hank supposed in some meaningful sense it had. Danny arrived with Silas and Book and 3 other men Hank had come to know over the months, Terrence from the Wyoming chapter, who turned out to have a background in nonprofit management. A man named Ray, who had spent 15 years as a high school teacher before the same complicated life circumstances as Book had redirected him, and Victor, who had driven up from Colorado because Danny had called him and he had said simply, when the meeting lasted 4 hours and produced something that Hank had never imagined, and that was in retrospect the most natural possible outcome of everything that had happened since January. They called it the Lawson Initiative, though Hank argued against the name and lost. The concept was this: a nonprofit organization legally structured and properly funded, dedicated to 3 interconnected programs. The first was legal defense and monitoring for agricultural landowners in financial distress, a network of attorneys led by Book who would proactively identify situations with the pattern markers of predatory foreclosure and intervene before families lost their land. The second was what Ray had designed, which he called the Crossroads Program, a mentorship and education fund for young people from the fringes of the justice system, specifically targeting the 18 to 25 demographic that Colt represented, providing vocational training, scholarship support, and the structured mentorship of men who had lived outside the boundaries and come back. The third was a maintenance and rebuilding fund, Victor's contribution, that would deploy skilled tradespeople to the properties of elderly or vulnerable landowners who couldn't afford preventive maintenance, the kind of slow deterioration that Sterling and people like him targeted because it made properties legally vulnerable. The funding came from 3 sources: a significant donation from the club's charitable foundation, which Silas authorized without fanfare, a grant application that Ray wrote, which was funded within 60 days by an agricultural foundation that had been looking for exactly this kind of initiative for 3 years, and a public fundraising campaign that launched off the back of the Tribune article and the television interview, and raised more money in its first 2 weeks than any of them had projected. Hank signed the incorporation papers at his kitchen table. Book was across from him. Victor was in the corner, not looking at the papers but present. Silas was at the window. When Hank signed the last page, he put the pen down and looked at the room and said, "Eleanor would have organized all of this better than any of us." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Silas said, "She would have." It was the first time he'd ever used her name. And the fact that he used it correctly, not as a reference, but as a presence, told Hank that someone had told him the story of her, which meant that someone had cared enough to tell it, which meant she was part of this room even if she wasn't in it. Hank looked at the table. He pressed his palm flat on the burn mark, same as always. And then he picked up the papers and handed them to Book. The day Hank would carry the longest came in late October. He had been on the phone with Ruth Kavanaugh. They talked regularly now, once every couple of weeks, the friendship of two people who have been through parallel versions of the same ordeal and have emerged into the same improbable light. She was telling him about the garden, about what had come up and what hadn't, about her daughter who was helping her restore the interior of the house, about a neighbor who had come by with a casserole and stayed for 3 hours. He noticed, talking about the future with a casual confidence that had been entirely absent from her voice in those first calls. The absence of loss from someone's voice is its own sound, distinct and particular, and Hank heard it and was glad. After he hung up, he sat on the porch in the October cold and looked at the east field. The hickory, his father. He hadn't visited the grave in a few weeks. He did it at irregular intervals, not on a schedule, when something felt like it needed to be said out loud to someone who had known him his whole life. He went today. He walked to the east field and stood at the grave and stood there for a while without saying anything, which was sometimes the right thing. Then he said, "Dad, it's been a year." He paused. "I almost lost the farm." Another pause. "I didn't." He put his hand on the hickory, the split trunk that had been struck by lightning in 1987 and had simply kept growing, the wound knitted over by 38 years of persistent, unreasonable life. There are a lot of people whose names you don't know who are living on their own land right now because of something that happened in your driveway last January. He stopped. "I thought you'd want to know that." He stood with the old tree for a while longer. The October wind moved through the field. He turned around and walked back to the house. The family day happened in November, the last Saturday before Thanksgiving, which was Silas's suggestion, and turned out to be exactly right. It was not planned as a large event. It became one anyway. The original guest list was the riders who had been at the farm in January, plus their immediate families, plus the families connected to the Lawson Initiative's first year of work. That number, when accumulated, was over 400. When word spread informally through the network, it became over 1,000. Hank stood on his porch at noon on that Saturday and looked at his farm, his fields, his rebuilt barn, his mended fences, his repaired water line, all of it solid and sound, and it was full of people. Not the organized formation of January, not the charged urgency of that morning with Sterling and the bulldozer and the court order. Just people, families, children running between the adults' legs in the way children do when they've been given space and permission. Old men talking on folding chairs, women at a long table that had materialized from somewhere, music from a truck radio, the smell of food from multiple sources simultaneously. It was loud and chaotic and completely without ceremony, which was the only way Hank would have wanted it. Ruth Kavanaugh was there. She had driven 4 hours from Browning. She came up the porch steps and shook his hand with both of hers the way Book had, and looked at him for a long moment. She was a small woman, mid-60s, with her grandmother's posture and her grandfather's eyes. You could tell looking at her that she came from people who built things. "I wanted to meet you properly," she said, "not on the phone." "I'm glad you came," Hank said. She looked at the farm, at all the people in it. "You did this," she said. "This happened because of you." Hank started to say what he always said, the deflection, the redirect to the blizzard and the bikers and the chain of things, and then he stopped. Because he thought about what he'd told Claire Hendricks in the kitchen about what the measure of a thing actually is, and he decided that deflecting this particular truth was its own kind of dishonesty. "I went out in a storm," he said. "Everything else was other people choosing to show up. I made it possible for them to choose." Ruth Kavanaugh looked at him steadily. "That's everything," she said. "That's the whole thing right there. You made it possible." He looked at her, he thought about that, and he accepted it fully without qualification, with the particular grace of a man who has finally learned at 67 years old that receiving something true about yourself is not pride, it's honesty. Yeah, he said, I suppose it is. Colt found him at 2 in the afternoon. He was in his second semester now, doing well. He'd sent Hank a text 2 weeks earlier with a photo of a test he'd passed, the number 94 circled in pen, no other message needed. He'd brought his mother, a quiet woman from Billings, who shook Hank's hand and then held it for an extra second and said only, thank you, in a way that covered more ground than the 2 words could technically carry. Colt stood beside her and had the slightly overwhelmed expression of a son who has brought his mother to meet someone important and is hoping everyone behaves, which everyone did. They stayed for an hour, and then Colt shook Hank's hand on the way out and said, I'll call you when I finish the program. Hank said, I expect you to. Colt grinned, full and unguarded, the grin of a young man who is beginning to understand that the future is something he gets to construct, rather than something that happens to him, and walked back through the crowd to find his mother. Silas appeared at Hank's shoulder at 3:30. He had a cup of coffee and the look of a man who is comfortable at the margins of large gatherings rather than at their center, which Hank had come to recognize as his natural habitat. How are you doing? Silas asked. I don't have words for it, Hank said honestly. Silas looked out at the field. That's usually when you're doing exactly right, he said. A pause, then, I want to tell you something. I told you in the barn what your face looked like when I woke up. What I didn't tell you. He stopped, took a breath in the almost imperceptible way that private men do when they're about to say something they've been carrying for a while. What I didn't tell you is what I thought when I saw it. Before I understood what had happened. Before I knew you'd carried us in, or who you were or why you'd done it. He looked at Hank directly. I thought whoever this man is, he's lived the kind of life where doing the right thing became automatic. Where he doesn't have to decide anymore, he just does it because it's what he is. He paused. I've spent 30 years trying to figure out what kind of man I want to be, and I found the answer in a barn in a blizzard. Hank looked at him. He felt the tightening in his throat again, the one that had been there on the porch on that Saturday morning in January when the engines first arrived, and he managed it the same way, with the same discipline of a man who feels deeply and expresses carefully. Silas, he said, you rode from Denver in January. He looked at him. That's not the behavior of a man who's still figuring out what he wants to be. Something moved in Silas's face, the same thing that had been there in the barn in February when Hank had said everyone was worth saving, that specific, almost painful softening that happens to a man when he is seen clearly and correctly for the first time in a very long time. He looked away briefly, then back. He raised his coffee cup in a small gesture, not quite a toast, just an acknowledgement one man to another of something that didn't need more words than it already had. Hank raised his own cup. They drank. The sun went behind the ridge at 4:15, and the temperature dropped the way Montana temperatures drop in November immediately without negotiation, the cold arriving fully formed rather than building. People began moving toward their vehicles, gradually the unhurried exit of people who have been somewhere good and are not rushing to leave it. There were handshakes and embraces and the exchange of phone numbers and the particular warmth of promises made by people who intend to keep them. Hank stood on his porch and watched it, all of it, the full scope of what this day had been, and he thought about January. He thought about the foreclosure notice. He thought about 4 a.m. in his father's chair waiting, not knowing. He thought about Sterling's face when the engines had first crested the horizon, and the certainty had gone out of him like air from a punctured tire. He thought about Eleanor's recipe box on the counter during the television interview, and how the interviewer had asked about it, and he'd said simply, my wife's, she was a better cook than me and a better person than me, and the best thing that ever happened to this farm. And the interviewer had not followed up because there was nothing to follow up till the statement was complete. Danny was the last to leave. He always was. He'd been the road captain for 3 years, and road captains don't leave until everyone else has cleared, which was a professional habit that had apparently become a personal one. He came up the porch steps and stood beside Hank, and they looked at the field together. Empty now, or nearly empty, just the tire tracks and the folding chairs being gathered and the last few people making their way toward the road. Same time next year, Danny said. Hank considered it. Probably bigger next year, he said. Danny laughed. Definitely bigger, he said. Victor is already talking about building a proper pavilion out in the south field. Hank looked at the south field. He thought about Victor with his plans on the plywood table. He thought about the man who builds things the way he cooks thoroughly and without shortcuts. "Tell him to draw it up," he said. Danny grinned. He went down the porch steps and walked to his bike and threw a leg over and looked back at Hank. Once a look that carried the whole year in it, from the blizzard to this afternoon, the full arc of what had happened between two people who should never have met and had and would not forget it. Hank raised his hand. Danny started the engine, and then he was down the driveway and onto the road, and the sound of it faded into the cold November evening until Hank couldn't hear it anymore. He stood on the porch alone. His farm was quiet around him, the good quiet of a place that has been full and is now resting, that knows it will be full again. He looked at the east field. He looked at the barn that Victor had repaired correctly and without shortcuts. He looked at the fence that Danny's people had rebuilt post by post into the January cold. He looked at the road that had been empty when this year began and had become, in the course of one blizzard and one morning and everything that followed, a road that led somewhere larger than he had known. He put his hand in his coat pocket and found Eleanor's photograph, worn at the edges, the summer of 1992, the dirt on her hands and the sun in her hair, and the laugh that he could still hear on the days when she was clear and the days when she was only a presence, and every day in between. He held the photograph and looked at his farm, and he thought about what he had told Claire Hendricks in the kitchen about property and what matters and the only true thing about a man. And then Henry Lawson stood on his father's porch on his father's land, surrounded by the evidence of what happens when one person does the right thing in the dark and the right people are watching, and he understood fully, finally without reservation, that he had not lost everything and found more than he had. He had lost what could be would be lost and kept what could not, and what could not be lost had turned out in the end to be everything that mattered, and it was still here, and it was enough, and it was his.